The Earth has never stopped rewriting its surface. Valleys have flooded, deserts have swallowed settlements, forests have reclaimed cities, and earthquakes have reduced entire landscapes to ruins. But here and there, something ancient remains untouched enough to make us wonder. A doorway still faces a forgotten horizon. Enormous stones remain locked together after thousands of years. Passages descend beneath structures whose original purpose has faded from memory. These places survived long after the worlds that created them disappeared, carrying fragments of knowledge that history could not preserve. Each discovery reveals another piece, but never enough to complete the story. Today, we follow these surviving traces into an ancient world where some of humanity's most remarkable mysteries are still waiting for an answer. Old Dongola stands as a contradiction carved into the edge of the Nile. For centuries, it functioned as the political and religious center of the Nubian kingdom of Makuria, one of the most resilient Christian states in medieval Africa. Its position was strategic, its structures durable, and its influence documented in both Arabic and Byzantine sources. Yet unlike cities that ended in fire, conquest, or disaster, Old Dongola did not collapse in a single moment. It faded. The problem is not that it disappeared. The problem is that the evidence does not clearly explain why. Located along a vital stretch of the Nile in what is now northern Sudan, Old Dongola controlled a corridor linking sub-Saharan Africa with Egypt and the Mediterranean world. Historical accounts from Arab geographers describe Makuria as a powerful and stable kingdom between the 7th and 13th centuries. Written records suggest long-term diplomatic relations with Islamic Egypt, including the Bakht Treaty, which maintained relative peace for centuries. From a geopolitical perspective, this location should have guaranteed continuity. River access meant water, agriculture, and trade. Natural desert barriers offered defense. Unlike marginal settlements, Dongola had every structural advantage required for survival. And yet, by the late medieval period, its prominence had diminished without a clearly identifiable rupture. Modern excavations, particularly those led by Polish archaeological missions since the 20th century, have revealed a city built in phases rather than destroyed and rebuilt. Churches were not razed but repurposed. One of the most significant findings is the transformation of a large cathedral complex into a mosque, likely around the 14th century. This transition lacks the expected archaeological signatures of conflict. There are no widespread burn layers, no mass destruction horizons, and no abrupt abandonment strata. Instead, the record shows continuity with modification. Walls were reused, foundations were preserved, urban space adapted, rather than collapsed. In comparison, sites like Pompeii present a clear destruction layer dated to 79 CE, while Angkor exhibits hydraulic system failures tied to environmental stress. Old Dongola shows neither pattern in a definitive form. The most technically puzzling aspect of Old Dongola lies in its construction. The majority of its buildings were made from mud brick, sun-dried bricks composed primarily of Nile silt, clay, water, and organic temper such as straw. By conventional engineering standards, this material is considered vulnerable. It is susceptible to erosion from wind, dissolution from water, and structural weakening under temperature fluctuations. Yet in Dongola, mud brick structures have endured for centuries in an environment defined by extremes. Daytime temperatures in the region regularly exceed 40 degrees Celsius, while seasonal winds transport abrasive sand capable of gradually eroding exposed surfaces. Under such conditions, untreated mud brick architecture typically degrades within decades unless continuously maintained. Scientific analysis of surviving walls suggests several factors contributing to their durability. First, the composition of Nile silt includes fine particles that, when compacted and dried, create a dense matrix with relatively low permeability. This reduces water infiltration, one of the primary causes of structural decay. Second, the addition of organic fibers such as straw increases tensile strength and limits cracking during drying cycles. Third, wall thickness plays a critical role. In Dongola, many structures exceed 1 meter in thickness, providing thermal mass that stabilizes internal temperatures and reduces stress from expansion and contraction. However, these explanations do not fully resolve the anomaly. Comparable mud brick sites across North Africa and the Middle East, such as rural settlements in Upper Egypt, show significantly higher rates of erosion and collapse when abandoned. Even in relatively dry environments, wind-driven abrasion gradually reduces wall height and structural integrity. In Dongola, preservation appears uneven but notably resilient in key areas, suggesting that construction techniques may have included additional, less understood optimizations. Some researchers propose the use of surface treatments or plasters that reduced exposure to direct erosion. Others point to urban layout, where clustered buildings shielded each other from prevailing winds. There is also the possibility that microtopography, slight Ittifar differences in terrain, redirected water flow during rare but intense rainfall events, minimizing damage. When compared to stone-built cities like Petra, where durability is expected due to the hardness of the material, Dongola presents a different type of engineering logic. It achieves longevity not through material strength alone, but through system-level adaptation, material composition, structural geometry, and environmental interaction working together. The unresolved question is whether this resilience was the result of deliberate optimization or accumulated empirical knowledge refined over generations. There is no surviving technical manual, no written explanation of construction standards. The outcome, however, indicates a level of environmental understanding that exceeds what is typically attributed to mud brick architecture of the period. Old Dongola was once a major center of Christian Nubia, with richly decorated churches featuring wall paintings that demonstrate connections to Byzantine artistic traditions. Over time, these spaces were altered to accommodate Islamic practices. The architectural evidence suggests adaptation rather than eradication. This gradual transition challenges assumptions about religious change in medieval contexts, where conversion is often associated with conflict or forced replacement. In Dongola, the process appears more complex. It implies either a slow demographic shift, sustained coexistence, or political restructuring that did not prioritize symbolic destruction. By the 15th century, Old Dongola had lost its status as a major political center. Archaeological evidence indicates reduced occupation intensity rather than sudden abandonment. Population decline appears incremental. Several hypotheses attempt to explain this pattern. Climate change may have altered Nile flood cycles, affecting agriculture. Trade routes could have shifted, reducing economic relevance. Internal political fragmentation may have weakened centralized authority. Yet none of these factors alone provides a complete explanation. Unlike Angkor, where sediment cores and hydraulic studies demonstrate systemic environmental stress, Dongola lacks a single dominant variable. Its decline is diffuse, distributed across multiple possible causes without a definitive primary driver. The broader significance of Old Dongola lies in its resistance to simple classification. It does not align with the standard models of urban collapse, catastrophic destruction, environmental failure, or abrupt conquest. Instead, it represents a different pattern: continuity followed by gradual dissolution. This pattern raises a larger issue in archaeological interpretation. If a major city can decline without leaving a clear causal signature, how many other sites might be misinterpreted due to the absence of dramatic evidence? The lack of a clear endpoint is itself a form of data, one that challenges assumptions about how civilizations end. If a powerful capital like Old Dongola could slowly fade without war, disaster, or a clear cause, then what does that say about how civilizations truly disappear, and how many others might have vanished the same way without leaving an answer? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Sarrazin entered modern history not through design, but by accident. In 1976, a farmer working near the Zaravshan River uncovered fragments of pottery unlike anything known in the region. Archaeologists soon followed, and what began as a small anomaly expanded into one of the most significant prehistoric discoveries in Central Asia. Beneath the surface lay a settlement dating to approximately 3,500 to 3000 BCE, placing it firmly within the late Neolithic to early Chalcolithic transition. Yet even at this earlier stage, Sarrazin did not resemble a primitive village. It appeared organized, structured, and unexpectedly advanced. Excavations conducted from the late 20th century into the early 21st century, led in part by archaeologist Abdullah Isakov, revealed a multi-layered settlement spanning several centuries. Each occupational layer added clarity, but also deepened the mystery. The earliest layers, dated to around 3500 BCE, revealed permanent architecture, rectangular mud brick structures, multi-room layouts, and clearly defined activity zones. Unlike typical Neolithic settlements, which often show irregular growth, Sarrazin displayed signs of intentional planning. The settlement extended across an estimated 90 hectares, making it unusually large for its time. As excavations progressed into middle layers, evidence of craft specialization emerged. Stone tools became more refined, ceramic production showed stylistic consistency, and most notably, metallurgical activity appeared. Remains of furnaces, crucibles, and slag deposits indicated repeated, controlled processes rather than isolated experimentation. By the later phases, Sarrazin had transformed into a hub of long-distance exchange. Archaeologists uncovered materials that could not have originated locally. Lapis lazuli traced to Badakhshan in present-day Afghanistan, carnelian beads associated with the Indus Valley civilization, and stylistic parallels with artifacts from Mesopotamia. These findings suggest that Sarrazin was integrated into a network spanning hundreds, possibly thousands of kilometers. In most regions, the transition from village life to urban organization follows a gradual trajectory. Sites such as Çatalhöyük, dated to around 7000 BCE, show dense habitation but lack formal planning or clear administrative structure. Later, Mesopotamian cities like Uruk, emerging around 4000 BCE, demonstrate increasing complexity but only after millennia of incremental development. Sarrazin disrupts this pattern. There is no clear evidence of earlier local settlements evolving into it. Instead, it appears almost fully formed, structured housing, specialized labor, and evidence of coordinated activity. This raises a fundamental question in archaeological theory whether urbanization can emerge independently in multiple regions, or whether knowledge transfer played a more significant role than previously assumed. Among all the anomalies at Sarrazin, none is more debated than its metallurgical sophistication. Evidence from the site indicates that inhabitants were not merely experimenting with native copper, but engaging in systematic extraction and processing. Archaeologists have identified slag deposits, furnace remains, and crucibles capable of withstanding high temperatures, suggesting repeated exposure to heat levels exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius. the approximate threshold required for copper smelting. This is significant because metallurgy, particularly in its early stages, is typically characterized by trial and error development. At sites across Anatolia and the Iranian plateau, early copper use often appears sporadic, with inconsistent results and limited standardization. Yet at Sarazm, tools exhibit uniform shapes and functional consistency, implying a degree of technical control that should not yet exist at this stage. Even more striking is the absence of a visible learning curve. There are no clear transitional phases showing gradual improvement in metallurgical techniques. Instead, the evidence suggests that knowledge was already established when it appeared at Sarazm. Comparatively, in regions like Anatolia and the Zagros Mountains, early metallurgy emerges slowly between 5000 and 4000 BCE, often limited to cold-hammered copper before advancing to smelting. Sarazm, however, appears to skip intermediate stages, presenting a system that is already operational. This leads to several unresolved possibilities. One is that metallurgical knowledge diffused rapidly across vast distances, reaching Central Asia earlier than expected. Another is that the origins of this knowledge lie in yet undiscovered sites, where the developmental phases remain hidden beneath unexplored terrain. A more complex interpretation suggests parallel innovation, multiple regions independently discovering similar techniques under comparable environmental pressures. Yet this does not fully explain the precision and repeatability observed at Sarazm. The metallurgy of Sarazm is not simply early, it is prematurely mature. The presence of non-local materials at Sarazm reinforces the idea that it was part of a broader system of exchange. Lapis lazuli, a deep blue metamorphic stone, highly valued in antiquity, is known to originate primarily from the Badakhshan region. Its appearance at Sarazm indicates trade routes extending at least several hundred kilometers. Carnelian beads, often associated with Indus Valley craftsmanship, suggest connections to a civilization located over 1,000 kilometers away. While direct trade cannot always be confirmed, the distribution of such materials implies a network of intermediary exchanges, linking distant regions into a shared economic system. This challenges earlier assumptions that early Central Asian communities were isolated. Instead, Sarazm may have functioned as a transitional hub, facilitating movement between the Iranian plateau, South Asia, and the Eurasian steppe. Despite its apparent success, Sarazm was eventually abandoned. Archaeological layers show a gradual reduction in activity rather than sudden destruction. There is no definitive evidence of warfare, invasion, or catastrophic collapse. Environmental explanations remain the most widely accepted. Changes in river flow, soil exhaustion, or regional climate shifts may have undermined the settlement's sustainability. However, precise data remains limited, and no single factor fully accounts for the decline. What remains is a pattern seen in multiple ancient contexts, a complex society that reaches a peak of organization only to fade without clear explanation. Sarazm does not fit conventional models of development. It appears very early, yet already displays features of an advanced society-planned layout, labor specialization, metallurgy, and long-distance trade. While these traits usually emerge gradually over time, at Sarazm they appear almost simultaneously, suggesting a form of compressed development. This raises a critical question. Are current models incomplete, or are key stages still missing from the archaeological record? Sarazm is not just an ancient settlement, it is a direct challenge to the linear timeline we once believed. What do you think? Was Sarazm an independent leap in human development, or evidence of a lost chapter we haven't discovered yet? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Jarkoton did not emerge from the ground as a dramatic, singular discovery. It began with fragments, scattered pottery, faint outlines of walls and subtle anomalies in the soil recorded during Soviet-era surveys in southern Uzbekistan in the 1970s. At first, it seemed like just another minor Bronze Age settlement, but as excavation expanded, the scale shifted dramatically. What lay beneath was not a village, but a structured urban centre covering dozens of hectares, dated roughly between 1500 and 1300 BCE, associated with the Sapali culture. And from that moment, the site began to contradict expectations. Conventional models of Bronze Age development suggest that complex urban systems emerged in a limited number of core regions, primarily Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley Civilization, and the Nile Valley. Central Asia, by contrast, has often been framed as a transitional zone dominated by pastoral or semi-nomadic groups. Jarkoton challenges that assumption. Excavations reveal defensive walls, organized residential sectors, and a central complex that appears to serve ritual or administrative functions. The layout suggests planning rather than organic growth. To put this into perspective, cities like Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, dated to around 2600 BCE, exhibit grid-based planning and drainage systems. Jarkoton, though later by nearly 1,000 years, appears in a region where such planning was not expected at all. This raises a critical question. Was urbanization in Central Asia independently developed, or was it influenced by distant civilizations through networks we still cannot fully trace? Perhaps the most unsettling contradiction at Jarkoton lies not in what was built, but in how it has survived. The city was constructed primarily from mud brick, an unbaked mixture of clay, water, and organic material. By all conventional engineering standards, mud brick is among the least durable building materials. In environments with temperature fluctuation, wind erosion, and seasonal moisture, such structures degrade rapidly, often within decades or centuries at most without continuous maintenance. And yet, at Jarkoton, large portions of walls, foundations, and architectural outlines remain identifiable after more than 3,000 years. This is not entirely unique, but the degree of preservation is unusual. For comparison, mud brick architecture in Mesopotamia often survives only as low mounds, heavily eroded and difficult to reconstruct without extensive interpretation. Even in relatively stable desert environments like parts of Egypt, mud brick structures typically require protective conditions, burial under sand, minimal rainfall, or deliberate conservation to remain intact over millennia. Jarkoton presents a more complex case. The site has been exposed, subject to environmental stress, yet still retains structural clarity. This leads to several unresolved possibilities. One hypothesis suggests advanced preparation techniques, specific ratios of clay to organic binders, controlled drying methods, or even unknown additives that increase durability. However, chemical analyses so far have not identified any dramatically unusual composition. Another possibility is environmental, that ancient climatic conditions in the region were significantly different, perhaps drier or more stable, reducing long-term erosion. Paleoclimate studies do indicate shifts in Central Asian climate over the past several thousand years, but not at a scale that fully explains the preservation seen here. A third, more subtle explanation is architectural intelligence design choices that minimized exposure, such as wall thickness, orientation relative to prevailing winds, or structural layering that slowed degradation. In other words, the material itself may be simple, but the way it was used could reflect a level of environmental adaptation that we are only beginning to understand. Still, none of these explanations fully resolves the contradiction. Mud brick should not last this long, under these conditions with this level of clarity. And yet, at Jarkoton, it does. Among the most debated features of Jarkoton is its ritual complex, where archaeologists have identified structures interpreted as fire altars. These installations bear a conceptual resemblance to later practices associated with Zoroastrianism, in which fire plays a central symbolic role. The problem is chronological. Zoroastrianism, as a formalized religious system, is generally dated to the early 1st millennium BCE, although its origins may extend earlier. Jarkoton predates this by several centuries. If the interpretation is correct, it suggests that elements of fire-centered ritual practice existed long before they were codified into a structured religion. Alternatively, the resemblance may be superficial, similar forms arising independently in different cultural contexts. Without written records, the function of these structures remains speculative, but their presence indicates that Jarkoton was not merely a settlement. It was a place where symbolic or ritual behavior was spatially organized and architecturally embedded. Artifacts recovered from Jarkoton complicate its isolation. Pottery styles, beads, and certain material forms show parallels with regions far beyond Central Asia, including the Indus Valley civilization and areas connected to Mesopotamia. This suggests participation in broader exchange networks, possibly linked to what archaeologists describe as the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, a system of interconnected settlements spanning parts of modern Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and northern Afghanistan. However, unlike Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley, where written records and well-defined trade routes provide context, Jarkoton exists in relative silence. There are no inscriptions, no administrative tablets, no direct evidence of organized long-distance trade infrastructure. The implication is paradoxical. Material evidence points to connectivity, but the mechanisms of that connectivity remain invisible. Equally puzzling is how Jarkoton ended. Archaeological layers do not show signs of violent destruction, no widespread burning, no mass casualties, no abrupt collapse. Instead, the evidence suggests gradual abandonment. This pattern aligns with broader regional transitions during the Late Bronze Age, when climatic shifts, changes in water availability, or evolving trade dynamics may have altered settlement viability. Yet in Jarkoton, the data is incomplete. There is no single event, no clear tipping point, only a slow fading from occupation into silence. Jarkoton is not the largest or most advanced city, but it does not align with any established historical model. It introduces urban planning in a region where it was not expected, preserves mud brick architecture beyond normal limits, suggests ritual systems earlier than recorded history, and shows signs of trade without leaving clear traces. Then it disappears without a specific cause. Jarkoton does not break history, it exposes its gaps. What do you think Jarkoton really represents, an isolated anomaly, or evidence of a forgotten system of early civilization? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Peikend, also known as Peikend, did not reveal itself through monumental ruins or dramatic artifacts, but through a slow and almost accidental process of recognition during archaeological surveys in the late 19th and early 20th centuries near Bukhara. What initially appeared to be nothing more than scattered mounds at the edge of the Kizilkum Desert gradually unfolded into the remains of a structured urban centre. Active from approximately the 4th century BCE to the 11th century CE, once integrated into the vast trade network of the Silk Road. Yet the importance of Peikend is not defined by its role in commerce or its chronological depth, but by the embedded technical logic of its construction, subtle, systematic, and unexpectedly advanced for a settlement in such an unforgiving environment. At first glance, Paikend appears to follow a conventional Central Asian model with a fortified citadel, surrounding residential quarters, and multiple defensive walls. But the deeper one examines its structure, the more deliberate its organization becomes. The internal street network is not random or organically formed. Instead, many pathways align along consistent axes, forming a controlled circulation system that suggests planning rather than gradual evolution. Defensive layers are arranged with redundancy in mind, where the failure of one boundary does not expose the entire settlement, indicating strategic foresight rather than reactive construction. When compared to other Silk Road cities such as Merv or Samarkand, whose layouts often reflect centuries of incremental expansion, Paikend gives the impression of being conceived with an underlying blueprint, as if its planners operated with a level of spatial abstraction that is rarely preserved in early desert settlements. This raises a deeper question about the measurement systems, surveying methods, and planning principles that enabled such consistency in a landscape where environmental constraints should have limited precision. If Paikend's urban design suggests intention, its water system suggests something far more complex: precision under extreme constraint. Situated on the margins of the Kizilkum Desert, where annual rainfall can drop below 100 millimeters and permanent surface water is virtually absent, the very existence of a stable population, likely numbering in the thousands at its peak, implies the presence of a highly reliable and carefully managed water infrastructure. Archaeological findings point to a distributed network of wells, reservoirs, and channels, arranged not randomly, but according to a coherent system that indicates coordinated planning. Some researchers propose that Paikend may have utilized a technology analogous to the Qanat systems known from ancient Persia, where underground tunnels, extending for tens of kilometers, transported groundwater across long distances while minimizing evaporation, maintaining gradients so precise that the elevation drop could be less than 1 meter per kilometer. To construct such a system without modern instruments would require a level of surveying accuracy and environmental understanding that borders on the extraordinary, involving not only the identification of underground aquifers, but also the ability to regulate flow rates with precision, ensuring that water neither eroded the channels through excessive velocity nor stagnated due to insufficient gradient. The balance is mathematically delicate, and sustaining it over long distances demands both technical skill and continuous maintenance. Even today, locating stable groundwater in arid regions requires geological expertise, yet Paikend's builders appear to have achieved this through methods that remain largely undocumented. What deepens the mystery is that only fragments of this potential system have been uncovered, with large portions still buried beneath desert sediment, leaving open the possibility that the visible remains represent only a fraction of a much larger hydraulic network. For comparison, the Qanat systems of Iran, some over 2,000 years old and still functional, are typically associated with large, organized societies capable of mobilizing extensive labor forces and maintaining complex infrastructure over generations. Yet Paikend does not clearly fit this model of centralized power. Instead, it appears as a regional hub, operating at the edge of major trade routes, raising the question of how such a settlement could develop and sustain a water management system comparable in sophistication to some of the most advanced hydraulic technologies of the ancient world. This suggests either that Paikend represents a localized peak of technical adaptation driven by environmental necessity, or that our current understanding captures only a partial view of a more extensive and coordinated system of knowledge that has yet to be fully revealed. Despite being constructed primarily from mud brick, a material typically associated with temporary or fragile structures, Pike End has preserved significant portions of its architecture for over 1,000 years, suggesting that its builders possessed a refined understanding of material composition and environmental interaction. The bricks themselves appear to have been produced using optimized mixtures of clay, sand, and organic fibers, enhancing both tensile strength and resistance to cracking, while certain walls exhibit layered construction techniques that distribute stress and mitigate erosion. In comparison to sites such as Çatalhöyük, where mud brick construction was common but subject to different climatic conditions, Pike End's desert environment introduces extreme temperature variations, persistent wind erosion, and minimal moisture, all of which would typically accelerate degradation. Yet the structures endure, creating a paradox in which a seemingly simple material is engineered for longevity in one of the most hostile settings possible. By the 11th century, Pike End had been largely abandoned, not through a sudden catastrophic event, but through a gradual process of decline that left little direct evidence of a singular cause. There are no extensive burn layers, no definitive signs of large-scale invasion, and no clear markers of epidemic collapse, suggesting that the city did not fall violently, but instead faded as its underlying systems began to fail. One plausible explanation lies in the shifting dynamics of Silk Road trade routes, which may have reduced the city's economic relevance, while another points to environmental changes, particularly the depletion or redirection of water sources that would have destabilized the delicate balance sustaining the settlement. If Pike End's survival depended on a finely tuned hydraulic system, even minor disruptions such as sediment blockage, structural collapse, or declining groundwater levels could have triggered a cascading failure, leading to the eventual abandonment of the city. Unlike river-based civilizations that can endure gradual environmental shifts, a desert city dependent on engineered water systems exists in a state of constant vulnerability, where the loss of technical functionality rapidly translates into the loss of habitability. What do you think Pike End truly represents, a natural evolution of ancient engineering pushed to its limits, or evidence of a level of technical understanding that history has only partially preserved? Kampir Tepe was first systematically investigated in the 1970s in southern Uzbekistan, along the banks of the Amu Darya. What initially appeared as a modest cluster of eroded mud brick structures quickly revealed something far more structured. Beneath layers of sediment lay a fortified settlement with clear defensive planning, positioned directly on what would have been a navigable river route. From the very beginning, archaeologists suspected that this was not an isolated town, but a strategic node connected to the broader network later known as the Silk Road. Excavations over several decades, especially from the late 20th century into the early 2000s, have gradually transformed Kampir Tepe from a simple ruin into a multi-phase archaeological puzzle. Early digs uncovered the outer defensive walls, constructed primarily from mud brick, with thicknesses in some sections exceeding 2 meters. These fortifications suggested a military purpose, comparable in defensive logic to frontier outposts found across ancient Bactria. Subsequent excavation campaigns revealed interior organization, narrow streets, storage areas, and what appear to be controlled entry points. The layout was not organic. Unlike settlements that evolve over centuries, Kampir Tepe appears to have been planned, its footprint relatively compact, estimated at only a few hectares, yet densely structured. Artifacts recovered across layers include ceramics, coins, and everyday tools. Some coins are attributed to the Greco-Bactrian period, roughly 3rd to 2nd century BCE, placing the site within a time frame consistent with the aftermath of the campaigns of Alexander the Great. This dating aligns Camper Tepe with other Hellenistic-influenced settlements across Central Asia, yet its scale and design remain unusual when compared to larger urban centers such as Ai-Khanum. One of the defining characteristics of Camper Tepe is its direct relationship with the river. Positioned at a point where the Amu Darya could be crossed or navigated, the site may have functioned as a controlled port or checkpoint. This duality creates the first major mystery. On one hand, the presence of storage areas and trade-related artifacts suggests economic activity. On the other, the fortified perimeter and restricted access points indicate surveillance and control. This combination mirrors certain Roman frontier forts, where trade and military oversight coexisted. Yet Camper Tepe predates many comparable Roman structures and exists in a completely different geopolitical context. If it was a port, why is its scale so limited? If it was a fortress, why include infrastructure associated with commerce? The evidence supports both interpretations, but fully confirms neither. The discovery of Hellenistic-style artifacts complicates the narrative further. Pottery forms, coinage, and certain architectural elements reflect influence from Greek traditions that spread into Central Asia after Alexander's eastern campaigns. However, Camper Tepe lacks the monumental architecture typically associated with major Hellenistic cities. For comparison, sites like Ai-Khanum feature large palatial complexes, theatres, and columned courtyards, clear markers of Greek urban planning. Camper Tepe, by contrast, is minimalistic. Its construction is utilitarian, almost austere. This raises a contradiction. The cultural influence is present, but the architectural ambition is not. This suggests that Camper Tepe may not have been a primary centre of Hellenistic culture, but rather a peripheral node, perhaps a logistical station where Greek-influenced administrators or merchants interacted with local populations. Yet even this interpretation leaves gaps, particularly regarding its precise administrative role. The most persistent and unresolved mystery surrounding Camper Tepe is not how it functioned, but how it ended. Archaeological evidence suggests that the site was abandoned rather than violently destroyed. There are no widespread burn layers, no mass graves, and no clear signs of catastrophic siege. This absence is significant. In many ancient sites, destruction leaves a signature: charred materials, collapsed fortifications, or weapon debris. At Camper Tepe, such indicators are minimal or absent. Instead, the structures appear to have been left to decay gradually. One leading hypothesis involves the Amu Darya itself. Rivers in Central Asia are known for shifting courses over time. A deviation of even a few kilometers could render a port obsolete. If Camper Tepe depended on direct river access, the loss of that connection would have undermined its strategic value almost immediately. Another possibility relates to broader economic shifts. As trade routes evolved, particularly with the expansion and contraction of Silk Road networks, smaller nodes may have been bypassed in favor of more efficient corridors. In such a scenario, Camper Tepe would not have been destroyed. It would simply have become irrelevant. However, neither explanation fully accounts for the abruptness implied by the archaeological record. Occupation layers suggest a relatively active phase followed by a clear cessation. There is little evidence of gradual decline through repurposing or long-term squatting, which is commonly observed in other abandoned settlements. This creates a paradox. Camper Tepe was too strategically placed to be casually abandoned, yet too abruptly deserted to reflect slow economic decay. Compared to sites like Ai-Khanum, which show clear phases of destruction and rebuilding, Camper Tepe's silence is more difficult to interpret. It does not tell a story of collapse, it suggests a withdrawal. Camper Tepe occupies a position at the intersection of multiple historical forces: the spread of Hellenistic culture, the development of early Silk Road trade, and the dynamics of Central Asian river systems. Yet it does not fully align with any single narrative. Its scale is too small to be a major city, yet its planning is too precise to be incidental. Its artifacts suggest external influence, yet its architecture remains locally grounded. Its location is strategic, yet its abandonment remains unexplained. In many ways, Kampatipa represents a category of site that challenges conventional models. It is not an outlier because it is anomalous. It is an outlier because it does not fit cleanly into existing frameworks. And in that sense, its greatest mystery may not be a single unanswered question, but the realization that entire layers of Central Asian history remain incomplete. If a settlement positioned along one of the most important ancient corridors could vanish without a trace of destruction, what does that imply about how many other such nodes have already been erased? And more importantly, how many pieces of the ancient world's connective system are still missing from the record? In the early 20th century, excavations led by the Italian Archaeological School of Athens on the Aegean island of Lemnos uncovered what initially appeared to be a modest prehistoric settlement. But as layers of soil were removed, it became clear that this site, now known as Polyokne, was something far more significant. Beneath the surface lay not a single village, but a sequence of urban phases stretching back to around 3,000 years before the Common Era. The discovery was brief in its moment, but profound in its implications. Europe may have hosted organized urban life earlier than previously assumed. What makes Polyokne uniquely valuable to archaeology is its stratigraphy. The site was divided into multiple chronological phases, commonly labeled blue, green, red, yellow, and brown, each representing a distinct stage of development. Unlike many ancient cities where layers blur into one another, Polyokne's phases are remarkably clear, almost as if the city had been deliberately reset several times. In the earliest blue phase, dating to approximately 3000 BCE, archaeologists identified organized housing clusters and defined pathways, features that suggest intentional planning rather than organic growth. By the green and red phases, the settlement expanded significantly, with more substantial structures, storage facilities, and early forms of communal architecture. The yellow phase marked the city's peak. Fortified walls, complex building layouts, and evidence of economic specialization began to emerge. Each excavation layer revealed not just continuity but transformation. The city did not simply grow, it adapted, reorganized, and evolved across centuries. Yet the deeper researchers dug, the more one pattern became clear. Polyokne was developing faster than expected for its time. Among the most debated discoveries is a structure interpreted by some scholars as a proto-civic building, possibly an early form of assembly hall. If this interpretation is correct, it would suggest that Polyokne had developed a form of collective decision-making long before such systems are traditionally associated with classical Greek cities like Athens. The building itself contains arranged seating and a layout consistent with gatherings rather than domestic use. However, without written records, its function remains speculative. Was this truly an early council chamber, or simply a multifunctional communal space? The uncertainty highlights a broader issue. Polyokne provides structural evidence of complexity, but lacks the textual confirmation that would anchor those interpretations in certainty. At the heart of Polyokne's mystery lies its infrastructure. The site reveals features that, when placed in a broader historical context, appear unexpectedly advanced for an early Bronze Age settlement in the Aegean. Excavations uncovered organized street layouts, with pathways that appear intentionally aligned rather than randomly formed. There is also evidence of drainage systems, stone channels designed to redirect water away from living spaces. Wells have been identified, suggesting a managed water supply rather than reliance on nearby natural sources alone. These elements, taken together, point to a level of urban planning that implies foresight, coordination, and technical understanding. To understand why this is unusual, it is useful to compare Polyocne with other early urban centers. In Mesopotamia, cities such as Ur and Uruk developed structured layouts and water management systems, but these were supported by large river systems like the Tigris and Euphrates. Similarly, the cities of the Indus Valley, notably Mohenjo-Daro, are famous for their sophisticated drainage networks, often cited as some of the earliest examples of urban sanitation in human history. Polyocne, however, existed on an island environment without comparable river systems or the same scale of population density. Despite this, it exhibits parallel features: planned streets, drainage solutions, and spatial organization separating domestic and communal areas. The question is not whether Polyocne had these systems, the archaeological evidence confirms it did, but how such systems emerged in this context. Was this an independent development, or the result of cultural transmission through trade networks? There is evidence that Polyocne was connected to wider Aegean trade routes, possibly interacting with regions that had more developed urban traditions. Yet the timeline complicates this explanation. Some of Polyocne's infrastructural features appear earlier than expected, raising the possibility that innovation occurred locally rather than being imported. Even more intriguing is the efficiency of these systems. The drainage channels, while simple in construction, are positioned in ways that suggest an understanding of water flow and terrain. This is not experimental design, it is functional, repeatable, and embedded within the city's layout. In modern terms, Polyocne does not display advanced technology in materials or tools, but in systems thinking. It reflects an early grasp of how to organize space, manage resources, and mitigate environmental challenges. And yet, there is no clear record of how this knowledge was developed, transmitted, or maintained. Unlike later civilizations, which leave behind written codes, engineering treatises, or standardized practices, Polyocne remains silent. Its infrastructure exists, but its intellectual framework is missing. Archaeological comparisons suggest that Polyocne was not isolated. Pottery styles and material culture show similarities to those found at Troy, indicating possible trade or cultural exchange. Geographically, Lemnos sits along key maritime routes in the Aegean Sea, making it a plausible hub for interaction between Anatolia and mainland Greece. If Polyocne was indeed part of this network, it may have played a role in the early spread of technological and social innovations. However, the extent of its influence remains unclear. Was it a peripheral settlement adopting external ideas, or an active participant shaping regional development? The archaeological record provides hints, but no definitive answers. The final phase of Polyocne, often associated with the brown layer, reveals signs of decline. Structural damage suggests the possibility of seismic activity. Walls appear to have collapsed in patterns consistent with earthquakes. What is missing, however, is evidence of recovery. Unlike other ancient cities that rebuild after destruction, Polyocne seems to have been gradually abandoned. There are no clear signs of large-scale warfare, no widespread burn layers, and no written accounts explaining its disappearance. The city simply fades from the archaeological record, leaving behind a fully formed urban system that was never fully understood even by those who built it. Polyocne challenges what we expect from early cities. A small isolated settlement shows levels of planning and infrastructure comparable to major civilizations, yet leaves behind no writing, no records, and no clear origin of its knowledge. It functions as a complete urban system, but without an explanation for how it reached that level. This is the contradiction at its core: a city that developed too early and disappeared without ever telling us how. What do you think really happened to Polyocne, and how did it become so advanced so early? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Koshoy Korgon sits in a wide, wind-swept valley at an altitude of roughly 1,800 meters, positioned along a secondary corridor of the Silk Road. Unlike many archaeological sites that vanished entirely before rediscovery, this location persisted in local memory, referenced in oral traditions long before formal study began. When systematic surveys were conducted during the 20th century under Soviet archaeological programs, researchers encountered not just ruins, but a contradiction embedded in the landscape itself. A fortified complex with thick defensive walls, rectangular planning, and a footprint spanning several hectares, yet surrounded by an absence, no visible urban sprawl, no extended settlement, no clear economic hub. From the moment it entered academic discourse, Koshoy Korgon was defined not by what it revealed, but by what it lacked. It was a structure that did not match its environment. Early excavations exposed a fortified enclosure with walls several meters thick, constructed from stone foundations reinforced by mud brick superstructures, a method consistent with regional building traditions, yet executed here on a scale that suggested long-term, organized occupation. Pottery fragments recovered from these layers were dated through typological comparison to between the 7th and 10th centuries CE, aligning the site with a period of intense movement and exchange across Central Asia. As excavations progressed, archaeologists uncovered internal divisions, rooms, corridors, and what appeared to be storage facilities, indicating planned spatial organization rather than temporary habitation. Certain ceramic forms and decorative patterns showed parallels with artifacts from Sogdiana and Western China, implying that goods, ideas, or people moved through or into this site across considerable distances. Yet with each new layer of evidence came a persistent absence. There were no extensive domestic waste deposits, no dense housing clusters, no large-scale infrastructure typical of sustained civilian populations. Compared with contemporaneous sites such as Afrasiab, where population density and craft production leave unmistakable archaeological signatures, Koshoy Korgon appeared physically complete, yet socially hollow, a place built for occupation but lacking the expected imprint of those who would have lived within it. In nearly all known historical contexts, fortifications of this magnitude exist to protect something measurable: population, wealth, administration, or strategic infrastructure, and the relationship between walls and what lies within or around them is typically direct and observable. Cities such as Bukhara and Merv illustrate this pattern clearly, where defensive architecture scales proportionally with economic importance and population density. Koshoy Korgon disrupts that logic. Its walls indicate the anticipation of threat, yet the surrounding valley yields no confirmed archaeological footprint of a settlement large enough to justify such preparation. One explanation suggests that a once existing urban center has been erased by erosion, agricultural activity, or later occupation, but this hypothesis encounters a statistical problem. Large settlements tend to leave behind resilient traces: ceramic scatters, burial grounds, foundation remnants that persist even after centuries of transformation. Their absence here is not impossible, but it is unlikely when compared across Silk Road sites. Another interpretation shifts the question entirely, proposing that the fortress was never designed to defend a city at all. Instead, it may have functioned as an enclosed operational space administrative, military or logistical detached from the conventional model of urban dependency. In this reading, Koshoi Korgon resembles not a protective boundary around a community, but a controlled node within a broader system whose other components have either vanished or remain undiscovered. 2. The materials used in constructing Koshoi Korgon stone, compacted earth, and fired brick are neither rare nor technologically advanced by the standards of their time, yet the endurance of the structure exceeds what would typically be expected from such components under prolonged environmental stress. The Abashi Valley experiences extreme seasonal variation, with winters dropping far below freezing and summers marked by dryness and intense solar exposure, conditions that accelerate the breakdown of mud brick and destabilize unprotected stonework. Over a span exceeding 1,000 years, these cycles should have significantly degraded the structure. However, large portions of the fortress walls remain identifiable, their alignment still legible, their mass still intact. When compared with sites such as Campiotepa, where similar materials have suffered more extensive erosion, the disparity becomes difficult to ignore. This suggests that the difference may not lie in the materials themselves, but in how they were assembled. Variations in layering density, wall thickness ratios, foundation anchoring, or moisture management techniques that have not been fully reconstructed. If such methods existed, they represent a form of practical engineering knowledge that was either localized, insufficiently documented, or lost over time, leaving behind a structure that continues to perform beyond the expectations set by its apparent simplicity. The dominant interpretation situates Koshoi Korgon within the defensive framework of the Silk Road, suggesting that it functioned as a fortified station protecting caravans, goods, or strategic movement through the region. Yet when examined against known examples of Silk Road infrastructure, this explanation begins to fracture. Caravanserai, the most common form of roadside support architecture, are designed for accessibility, featuring open courtyards, defined entry points, and facilities tailored to merchants and animals, with scale calibrated to practical needs rather than defensive excess. Koshoi Korgon, by contrast, presents a different architectural language. Its walls are thicker, its layout more enclosed, and its defensive posture more pronounced than what would typically be required for a trade outpost. Furthermore, its geographic position, while connected to regional routes, does not correspond to the most critical junctions identified in historical reconstructions of Silk Road networks. This creates a functional imbalance. If it were a caravanserai, it is overbuilt. If it were a military base, it lacks the broader strategic context expected of such installations. Alternative hypotheses propose roles as a taxation checkpoint, a storage depot, or a controlled transit hub. Yet each explanation addresses only part of the structure's characteristics, while leaving others unresolved. The fortress appears to belong to a category that is familiar in fragments, but incomplete as a whole. Archaeological sites often preserve the circumstances of their decline, whether through layers of ash indicating fire, concentrations of weaponry suggesting conflict, or abrupt abandonment patterns that freeze moments of disruption in place. Yet Koshoi Korgon offers no such clarity. There is no substantial evidence of large-scale destruction, no definitive signs of siege, and no clear indicators of sudden catastrophe. Instead, the available data suggests a gradual withdrawal of activity, a slow fading rather than an abrupt end. This pattern complicates interpretation because structures of significant defensive and logistical value are rarely abandoned without cause, and when they are, that cause typically manifests in the archaeological record. While Central Asia underwent numerous political and economic transformations between the early medieval period and later centuries, including shifts in trade routes, regional power dynamics, and environmental pressures, none align cleanly or exclusively with the timeline implied by the site's decline. The result is not a narrative of destruction, but a silence, a structure that ceased to function without leaving behind a definitive reason, as though its relevance diminished in a way that left no trace strong enough to be recorded. Koshoi Korgon is not mysterious because it cannot be studied, but because it does not fit established patterns. It is a fortress without a city, built with simple materials yet unusually durable, oversized for its assumed Silk Road role and abandoned without a clear cause. In archaeology, meaning depends on recognizable patterns between structure and function. And here that pattern breaks down. The site is fully visible, yet not fully explainable, leaving a persistent gap between what is known and what can be understood. What do you think Koshoi Korgon really was? A forgotten fortress, a hidden control point, or part of a larger system we still haven't uncovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The discovery began not with myth, but with silence, an untouched palace buried on the eastern edge of Crete. In 1961, Greek archaeologist Nikolaos Platon excavated what would become known as Zakros Palace, the fourth major palace of the Minoan civilization. Unlike Knossos or Phaistos, Zakros had never been rebuilt after its destruction around 1450 BCE. What Platon uncovered was not a ruin shaped by centuries of reuse, but a system frozen at the exact moment it failed. Within its walls lay hundreds of clay tablets, thousands of ceilings, and entire rooms dedicated not to ritual, but to storage and control. The most unsettling detail was not their presence, but their organization. These were not scattered remnants of writing. They were grouped, categorized, and isolated in specific architectural zones, suggesting something far more advanced, a structured archive. And yet, the script inscribed across these tablets, Linear A, remains unreadable to this day. We are left with a complete system of information and no access to its meaning. The deeper the excavation progressed, the clearer the contradiction became. Bronze Age societies, typically characterized by limited literacy and localized administration, were not expected to produce centralized data systems. In Mesopotamia, for example, cuneiform archives from cities like Ur or Mari consisted of thousands of tablets, but their distribution was often tied to temples or individual scribal households. Even in Egypt, administrative papyri were fragile, decentralized, and rarely preserved in situ. Zakros, by contrast, presents something different, a spatially integrated archive embedded within a palace, combining storage, authentication, and controlled access. This raises the first unresolved question: how did a society, without a fully deciphered writing system, develop what appears to be a multi-layered bureaucratic structure? The tablets themselves provide indirect evidence. Their sizes are relatively standardized, often ranging between a few centimeters to palm-sized formats, suggesting predefined uses, inventory, transactions, or allocations. Many are accompanied by clay ceilings impressed with intricate designs, animals, abstract symbols, and composite motifs. These are not decorative. Statistical analysis of seal repetition shows that certain seal types recur across multiple rooms, while others are restricted to specific zones. This implies a system of identity encoding each seal, potentially representing an individual, an office, or a functional role. In modern terms, this resembles access control. Unlike the cylindrical seals of Mesopotamia, which rolled continuous images across clay, Minoan seals were stamped, discrete, and highly variable. At Zakros, over 500 unique seal types have been identified. The probability of such diversity emerging without a controlled administrative framework is extremely low. It suggests intentional differentiation, possibly a hierarchy of permissions. Some seals appear only in high storage zones, others in peripheral rooms, hinting at layered authority within the system. But the most paradoxical aspect of the archive lies in its material. The tablets were never meant to survive. They were made of unfired clay, soft, temporary, designed for short-term use. In Mesopotamia, such tablets were routinely recycled, dissolved back into clay after their purpose expired. Yet at Zakros, these tablets endured for over 3,400 years. The reason is accidental. The palace was destroyed by fire, likely during the widespread Late Bronze Age collapse around 1450 BCE. Temperatures exceeding several hundred degrees Celsius effectively fired the clay, transforming fragile records into ceramic artifacts. However, not all tablets were affected equally. Some show partial firing, others complete vitrification. A subset exhibits pre-exposure to heat edges hardened more than their cores. This irregularity has led to speculation that certain tablets may have been intentionally placed near heat sources before the final destruction. If true, it would suggest an awareness, however limited, that heat could enhance durability. No direct evidence confirms this as a standardized practice, but the pattern is difficult to ignore. The architecture surrounding the archive introduces another layer of complexity. Zakros is not the largest Minoan palace, covering approximately 8,000 square meters, significantly smaller than Knossos, which exceeds 20,000. Yet its internal layout is unusually compartmentalized. Instead of vast ceremonial halls, Zakros contains clusters of narrow rooms connected by controlled corridors. Many of these rooms contain large storage jars, pithoi each capable of holding hundreds of liters of oil, grain, or wine. These are not randomly placed containers. Their positioning suggests logistical planning. Fixed storage units aligned with wall structures, often adjacent to rooms containing tablets and ceilings. The implication is clear. Physical goods and their recorded data were co-located. Inventory was not abstract. It was spatially anchored. In modern logistics, this is fundamental. Data follows storage. Comparative studies reinforce this interpretation. At Knossos, storage and administration are present, but heavily intertwined with ceremonial architecture. At Vaistos, storage areas exist but lack the same density of ceilings and tablets. Zakros stands apart as a site where economic control appears to dominate architectural design. Some scholars have proposed that Zakros functioned as a maritime trade hub, its eastern position facilitating contact with the Near East. If so, the archive may have been managing incoming and outgoing goods, tracking volumes, origins, and allocations. Yet without deciphering Linear A, this remains hypothesis, and that is the central tension of Zakros. We can reconstruct the system, but not the information it processed. Linear A itself deepens the mystery. Unlike Linear B, which was later deciphered and found to encode an early form of Greek Linear A, has resisted all attempts at translation. Its symbols number in the hundreds, combining phonetic and logographic elements. Frequency analysis suggests structured language, possibly administrative in nature, but no bilingual inscriptions like the Rosetta Stone have ever been found to unlock it. This leaves researchers in a position rarely encountered in archaeology, observing a functioning data infrastructure without understanding its content. The final layer of the mystery emerges when considering collapse. Around 1450 BCE, Zakros, along with other Minoan centers, was destroyed likely as part of a broader regional upheaval involving earthquakes, volcanic activity, and possible Mycenaean expansion. The archive was never recovered, never reorganized, never rebuilt. It simply stopped. From a systems perspective, this is equivalent to a sudden shutdown with no backup. And yet, the physical remnants remain precise. Rooms retain their functions, tablets remain grouped, seals remain where they were last used. The system did not decay gradually, it was interrupted mid-operation. This creates a rare archaeological condition, a preserved failure state. When viewed through a modern lens, Zakros challenges a fundamental assumption that advanced information systems require advanced technology. Here, without metal data carriers, without digital encoding, without even a fully understood script, a Bronze Age society constructed a network of data management that exhibits principles recognizable today. Standardization, authentication, compartmentalization, and integration with logistics. The tools were simple, the system was not, and that is where the true mystery lies. Not in whether the Minoans possessed lost machines or unknown energies, but in whether they developed a level of organizational intelligence that we have consistently underestimated. Zakros does not suggest a forgotten technology in the conventional sense. It suggests something more subtle and perhaps more profound. That complexity does not always leave behind a language we can read. In the middle of Egypt's western desert, where annual rainfall is effectively zero and summer temperatures regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius, Al-Khaga Oasis should not exist as a long-term human settlement. Yet, archaeological evidence shows continuous occupation spanning more than 2,000 years, and the mystery is not simply survival but stability, because beneath the sand lies an invisible infrastructure of underground water systems, desert fortifications built from fragile materials that refuse to decay, and a necropolis where painted surfaces remain preserved far beyond what environmental physics would predict. Meaning, Al-Khaga is not defined by what stands above ground, but by a network of technologies that operate quietly, precisely, and without clear documentation of how they were engineered, turning what should have been an uninhabitable void into a controlled and sustained human environment. Al-Khaga first entered modern scientific awareness during 19th century expeditions, mapping ancient trade routes linking the Nile Valley to sub-Saharan Africa, where early survey teams documented scattered ruins. But only in the 20th century did systematic excavation reveal that these were not isolated remnants, but parts of a coordinated system, as remote sensing, geological surveys, and field archaeology uncovered Qanat-style underground channels, Roman military installations, and the extensive Bagawat necropolis, transforming the oasis from a peripheral desert outpost into one of the clearest examples of long-term engineered adaptation to hyper-arid conditions, supported by layered occupation evidence, ceramic analysis, and radiocarbon dating that confirms sustained habitation across multiple historical periods. The survival of Al-Khaga depends on Qanat systems, underground tunnels designed to transport groundwater over long distances using gravity alone, and these channels often extend between 10 and 15 kilometers, with vertical shafts spaced at consistent intervals. Yet what makes them extraordinary is their gradient, because modern hydraulic engineering indicates that stable flow without erosion or stagnation requires slopes of roughly 1 to 2 meters per kilometer, and measurements taken in comparable North African and Middle Eastern systems show that Al-Khaga's channels fall within this range with deviations of only a few centimeters over hundreds of meters, implying a level of precision that suggests an advanced understanding of hydrostatic pressure, subsurface geology, and long-distance alignment without visible reference points, which becomes even more significant when compared to Persian Qanats of the 1st millennium BCE that demonstrate similar efficiency, meaning two geographically separated systems converged on nearly identical engineering solutions without shared documented theory, leaving a gap between observed capability and recorded knowledge that modern archaeology has yet to fully bridge. During the Roman period, Al-Khaga became part of a defensive and logistical chain protecting trans-desert trade routes, where fortresses such as Qasr al-Guaita and Dush were constructed primarily from mud brick, a material that under normal environmental stress should degrade rapidly when exposed to temperature fluctuations exceeding 30 degrees Celsius within a single day, continuous wind-driven sand abrasion, and minimal moisture cohesion. Yet many of these structures have persisted for over 1,500 years, and laboratory analysis of ancient mud brick samples across Egyptian desert sites suggests that their durability may be linked to high clay content combined with sand. Organic fibers such as straw acting as tensile reinforcement, and controlled drying processes that reduce internal cracking. But even when these variables are replicated experimentally, the resulting material does not consistently match the long-term durability observed in situ, indicating that either the extreme aridity of the Western Desert creates a preservation environment more stable than current models predict, or ancient builders developed optimized compositions and structural techniques that remain only partially understood. Among the most perplexing features of Al-Khaga is the Bagawat necropolis, a vast early Christian cemetery containing more than 260 domed tombs dating from approximately the 4th to 7th centuries CE, where inside several chapels, wall paintings depicting biblical scenes such as the Exodus remain visible with remarkable clarity. And from a conservation science perspective, pigment survival depends on chemical stability, interaction with oxygen and humidity, and the thermal expansion and contraction of the underlying plaster, yet desert environments typically accelerate degradation through daily heating and cooling cycles that generate microfractures, leading to flaking and pigment loss, while intense ultraviolet radiation further breaks down organic and inorganic color compounds, making the preservation at Bagawat highly anomalous. Because pigments retain visible coloration after more than 15 centuries, structural domes remain intact despite being constructed from mud brick, and interior microclimates appear to reduce the rate of deterioration, which contrasts sharply with sites such as the Roman catacombs, where preservation is facilitated by stable humidity and minimal airflow, whereas Bagawat exists in an exposed desert environment where such stability should not naturally occur, leading researchers to propose multiple overlapping explanations, including the use of mineral-based pigments such as iron oxides with high muqawamat to ultraviolet radiation, architectural dome designs that regulate internal temperature gradients and reduce thermal stress, and natural sealing effects created by accumulated dust layers that limit airflow and environmental exchange. Yet none of these hypotheses independently accounts for the degree of preservation observed, suggesting that Bagawat represents a rare convergence of environmental conditions, material science, and architectural design that challenges existing models of long-term decay in extreme climates. The Temple of Hybis, constructed during the Persian period in the 6th century BCE, contains relief carvings with remarkable uniformity, where the incised lines maintain consistent depth and spacing across large stone surfaces, indicating controlled techniques and repeatable processes. And although experimental archaeology demonstrates that copper and early iron tools are capable of producing such carvings, they typically result in inconsistencies and require extensive labor investment, whereas the consistency observed at Hybis suggests highly trained artisans working within standardized systems, possibly employing guides, templates, or iterative carving methods that allowed for precision approaching proto-industrial production, raising questions about efficiency labor organization, and the transmission of technical knowledge in the absence of written manuals or preserved toolkits that could fully explain how such consistency was achieved across an entire architectural complex. What do you think explains Bhagawat's preservation? A rare convergence of environmental factors, or evidence of techniques that have been lost to history? Along the Red Sea escarpment, on a wind-exposed plateau more than 2,600 meters above sea level, Quahito at first appears to be a modest cluster of ruins. But beneath that simplicity lies a contradiction. Here, in an environment defined by water scarcity, thermal stress, and erosion, ancient builders created a settlement that not only endured, but operated with a level of engineering logic comparable to far more advanced civilizations. The most unsettling mystery is not what was built, but how every part of the system seems to solve problems with an efficiency that should not have been possible with the tools and knowledge of its time. Although local populations had long known of the ruins, Quahito entered formal archaeological awareness in the early 20th century, during surveys of the Eritrean highlands conducted under Italian colonial administration. Subsequent expeditions throughout the 20th century mapped the plateau, revealing an extensive network of terraces, reservoirs, temples, and domestic structures spread across several square kilometers. Artifacts recovered, including inscriptions in the South Arabian script and architectural parallels, linked the site to the Kingdom of Aksum, a major trading power between roughly the 1st and 7th centuries CE. Yet even with this cultural attribution, the technological coherence of Quahito remained unexplained. Excavations produced fragments of a civilization but not the blueprint behind it. The defining constraint of Quahito is water. The plateau lacks any permanent river, and modern rainfall averages between approximately 300 and 500 millimeters annually, highly seasonal and unreliable. Yet archaeological evidence indicates a settlement capable of supporting a substantial population. At the center of this paradox stands the Saphira Dam, an ancient structure designed to capture and store runoff from rare rain events. Combined with rock-cut cisterns and channel systems, the plateau forms an integrated hydraulic network. Estimates suggest that even a modest reservoir capacity of several thousand cubic meters could sustain hundreds, possibly thousands of inhabitants if managed efficiently. This implies not only construction capability, but hydrological foresight understanding runoff patterns, evaporation rates, and storage efficiency. Comparatively, Roman cistern systems such as those in North Africa relied on similar principles, but were typically supported by formalized surveying tools, standardized measurements, and written engineering traditions. At Quahito, no such documentation has been found. The system exists, functions logically, yet lacks an identifiable knowledge framework. The architecture of Quahito is dominated by dry stone masonry, carefully shaped blocks assembled without mortar. This technique is widespread in ancient construction, from Mediterranean terraces to Andean walls. However, the execution here introduces a critical anomaly. Stone blocks are fitted with remarkable precision, reducing voids and enhancing structural stability. In many locations, walls remain standing after nearly 2,000 years of exposure. The precision suggests controlled shaping, yet there is limited evidence of advanced metal tools typically associated with such work. From an engineering standpoint, such tight-fitting construction reduces internal stress distribution and increases resistance to lateral forces, including wind and minor seismic activity. But this raises a question of intent. In a resource-limited environment, why invest labor into achieving a level of precision beyond what is structurally necessary? This pattern echoes other ancient sites such as Inca stonework at Machu Picchu, where precision appears to exceed immediate functional requirements. In both cases, the construction implies a deeper understanding of material behavior than the archaeological record clearly supports. The most difficult mystery to reconcile is not structural design, but material survival. High-altitude plateau environments impose extreme stress on stone construction. Daily temperature fluctuations can exceed 20 degrees Celsius, producing cycles of thermal expansion and contraction. Over time, this leads to microfracturing, displacement, and eventual collapse, particularly in dry masonry systems lacking binding agents. Wind erosion further accelerates degradation, especially in exposed terrains such as Kuhaito. Under such conditions, many ancient dry stone structures elsewhere show significant collapse within centuries. Yet at Kuhaito, numerous walls and terraces remain partially intact after nearly 2 millennia. Stones show limited displacement. Structural lines remain coherent. In some cases, surface textures suggest deliberate shaping or finishing that may influence weather resistance. From a material science perspective, durability at this scale implies one or more of the following. Careful selection of lithology, choosing stone types with low porosity and high Macaulmet to thermal stress. Optimization of block geometry, minimizing stress concentrations and improving load distribution. Possible surface treatment, whether through polishing, heat exposure, or other unknown methods that alter erosion rates. The absence of binding material makes this even more striking. Stability emerges purely from geometry, mass, and friction. When compared to other ancient sites exposed to similar climates such as dry stone settlements in the Levant or North Africa, Kuhaito's preservation appears disproportionate. It does not simply survive. It persists beyond what environmental models would predict. Beyond individual structures, the plateau reveals signs of coordinated planning. Terraces are aligned to maximize land use and possibly control runoff. Pathways connect elevated and lower zones efficiently. Architectural clusters suggest zoning, domestic, ceremonial, and possibly administrative. Such organization implies a systemic approach to settlement design. Yet, unlike Roman or Mesopotamian contexts, there is no surviving body of written engineering instructions, measurement systems, or architectural treatises associated with the site. This absence creates a paradox. The physical evidence indicates planning. The historical record does not preserve the process. Kuhaito is often interpreted as part of the broader Aksumite world, a civilization known for trade networks extending across the Red Sea and into the Mediterranean. However, even within that context, the plateau stands apart. Its solutions are highly localized, tailored to a specific environmental constraint. Its engineering is efficient, but not visibly derived from known traditions. And most importantly, its knowledge system, whatever produced it, has left almost no trace. There is no gradual progression visible in the archaeological layers that leads clearly to this level of integration. Instead, the system appears already functional, already optimized. So how did a system this coherent exist, without leaving behind the knowledge that made it possible? What do you think explains Kuhaito's engineering, lost knowledge, overlooked science, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Greek gymnasium stands in a place where Greek civilization was never supposed to survive. At the far eastern edge of the Hellenistic world, thousands of kilometers from Athens, a structure appears precise, symmetrical, intellectually designed, and culturally rigid, refusing to adapt to its environment, refusing to simplify, instead replicating a system in full, and that is where the mystery begins. The ruins of Ai-Khanoum were first systematically excavated in the 1960s by a French archaeological mission led by Paul Bernard, and located at the confluence of the Oxus River in ancient Bactria, the site revealed a fully developed Hellenistic city with theatres, palaces, and most unexpectedly a massive gymnasium, where inscriptions and architectural remains, including Greek philosophical maxims, confirmed not only cultural presence, but a deliberate intellectual transplantation across thousands of kilometers. The gymnasium measures approximately 100 by 100 meters, enclosing a central courtyard surrounded by colonnaded corridors, a scale comparable to major gymnasia in core Greek regions such as Delphi, and even parts of Alexandria during the Hellenistic period. Yet Ai-Khanoum itself was not a dense intellectual hub, with estimates based on its urban footprint suggesting a population likely under 10,000, meaning a structure of this magnitude would typically serve a significantly larger civic body, as in classical Greek cities, gymnasia were deeply integrated into political and philosophical life, often supporting hundreds of active participants simultaneously. But here the numbers do not align, because the architectural investment columns, plastered surfaces, training rooms, lecture spaces implies continuous high-volume use, while archaeological evidence instead indicates limited occupancy density, raising a critical question of whether the gymnasium was built for the population that existed or for a population that was expected but never fully materialized. The layout of the gymnasium follows strict geometric principles including axial symmetry, proportional spacing, and orthogonal alignment, where the central courtyard is framed by a peristyle colonnade and rooms are distributed along predictable modular intervals, and measurements taken during excavation indicate deviations of only a few centimeters across long structural spans, a level of precision expected in regions where Greek surveying traditions were well established, through techniques later formalized in works associated with Euclid. Yet Ai-Khanoum presents a contradiction because the site lies in a seismically and geologically variable region, where soil composition near the Oxus River consists of layered sediments prone to shifting, while local Central Asian constructions of the same era often show misalignments of several degrees due to terrain adaptation and less rigid planning systems. But the gymnasium resists this pattern entirely, as its geometry is not adaptive but imposed, suggesting that maintaining such alignment would require not only precise measurement tools, but also a controlled construction process capable of compensating for environmental irregularities. And although no direct evidence of advanced surveying instruments has been recovered at the site, the final architectural outcome implies a level of planning discipline that exceeds what the local context alone can reasonably explain. The most technically perplexing aspect of the gymnasium lies in its materials, because the primary construction medium is mud brick, an earthen composite typically made from clay, water, and organic timber such as straw, which under standard conditions is highly vulnerable to environmental degradation, especially in arid climates with strong wind exposure, where erosion rates can significantly weaken adobe structures within centuries if left unmaintained. And yet, at Ai-Khanoum, structural remains have persisted for over 2,000 years, with field reports indicating that some wall sections retain clear stratification and edge definition that allow archaeologists to reconstruct building plans with high accuracy, while compressive strength estimates derived from surviving fragments suggest unusually consistent density across brick layers, implying controlled production rather than variable ad hoc fabrication. And when compared with broader archaeological data, the anomaly becomes more pronounced, as adobe constructions in Mesopotamia often require periodic rebuilding within 1 to 3 centuries, and unmaintained mud brick settlements across Central Asia typically lose structural clarity within several hundred years, whereas at Ai-Khanoum identifiable architectural outlines remain after more than 2 millennia of exposure, leading to several competing hypotheses. including the possibility that the ratio of clay to temper was optimized beyond typical local practices with mineral inclusions from Oxus alluvial deposits, enhancing cohesion and resistance to microfracturing, or that layering techniques involving uniform brick dimensions and tightly controlled bonding patterns reduced internal stress points and improved load distribution over long periods, or that surface treatments such as plaster coatings acted as protective barriers against wind erosion and thermal expansion. Yet no single explanation fully accounts for the observed durability. And the core issue is not that the materials themselves were technologically advanced, but that their performance exceeds expectations relative to both composition and environment, indicating an underlying construction logic that appears disproportionately refined for its geographical and cultural context. The Greek gymnasium was never simply a physical training facility, but rather an institutional core where education, philosophy, and civic identity were shaped. And inscriptions found at Ai-Khanum, including moral and philosophical teachings, reflect traditions deeply rooted in classical Greek intellectual life, suggesting intentional cultural replication at a scale that raises deeper questions. Because constructing such a system in a distant and culturally distinct region implies not only a desire to preserve identity, but potentially an effort to project it, leading to two primary interpretations in which the gymnasium either functioned as a tool of cultural persistence, allowing Greek settlers to maintain continuity in a foreign environment, or as a strategic forward node of Hellenistic influence designed to extend and stabilize a broader cultural network. And in both interpretations, the structure transcends its physical role and becomes a mechanism for shaping human behavior, education, and identity across space. Do you think this structure served a practical need, or was it a deliberately constructed replica of civilization? Share your thoughts in the comments below. High in the Lake Titicaca basin of western Bolivia, near the core territory of the Tiwanaku civilization, lies a settlement that should not exist in the form we see it today. Lucaramata does not overwhelm with monumental gates or towering stone icons. Instead, it unsettles for a different reason, because it looks incomplete yet strangely intentional, as if frozen mid-thought. Archaeological surveys indicate continuous occupation from roughly 1500 BCE to 1000 CE, spanning nearly 2.5 millennia, a duration that places Lucaramata among the longest continuously inhabited sites in the Andean highlands. But what truly sets it apart is that many structural patterns, agricultural systems, and spatial organizations seen here appear before they are fully realized at Tiwanaku itself, suggesting a developmental sequence that runs counter to expectations. This raises a rarely asked question in archaeology. What if Lucaramata was not a peripheral settlement, but a prototype, a place where systems were tested, refined, and sometimes abandoned long before they shaped one of the most influential civilizations in pre-Columbian South America? Unlike many ancient cities that vanish beneath jungle or desert, Lucaramata was never truly lost, as its remains persisted in the landscape and blended into agricultural zones surrounding Lake Titicaca, quietly existing without dramatic rediscovery. Systematic archaeological investigation began in the mid-20th century, with major work during the 1970s and 1980s led by researchers such as Alan Colata, who revealed that Lucaramata was not a single-phase settlement, but a layered record of transformation, where architecture evolved gradually, agricultural systems expanded and contracted, and social organizations shifted across centuries. Unlike Tiwanaku, which presents a relatively unified urban vision with standardized monumental planning, Lucaramata reads more like a timeline of experimentation, a site where ideas were continuously tested rather than finalized, offering archaeologists a rare longitudinal view into how a complex society may have developed its systems over time. excavations show that Lucarmata developed gradually without the sudden architectural standardization observed at Tiwanaku between roughly 500 and 800 CE, and instead its construction phases reveal variation, where different building techniques coexist, some refined while others appear abandoned mid-process, suggesting an iterative approach rather than a finalized plan. In Tiwanaku, stone blocks are often precisely cut and fitted with minimal mortar, reflecting a mature engineering tradition, whereas at Lucarmata, archaeologists encounter walls with inconsistent alignment, foundations indicating redesign during construction, and transitions between crude and advanced masonry within the same structural contexts, patterns that are difficult to interpret as simple inefficiency. Comparable developmental layering has been observed at sites such as Çatalhöyük, where architecture reflects social adaptation over time, yet Lucarmata differs in both scale and duration, persisting for centuries under increasingly complex environmental and social conditions, implying that what appears incomplete may actually represent a phase of continuous experimentation. This leads to an unsettling implication that Lucarmata may not be a less advanced site at all, but rather a place where advancement itself was being defined through repeated trial, error, and refinement. Surrounding Lucarmata lies one of the most sophisticated ancient agricultural systems ever documented, the raised field system known locally as Waru Waru, which operates in an environment that by conventional standards should be agriculturally unstable. Given that the altitude exceeds 3,800 meters above sea level, nighttime temperatures frequently fall below freezing, frost events occur unpredictably, and soil fertility is naturally limited without intervention. Despite these constraints, the system achieves remarkable efficiency by constructing elevated planting platforms separated by water-filled canals, where solar radiation heats the water during the day, and that stored heat is slowly released at night, creating a localized thermal buffer that can raise surrounding air temperatures by approximately 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, a seemingly small margin that is nevertheless sufficient to prevent frost damage to crops. Modern experimental reconstructions in the Lake Titicaca Basin during the 1980s demonstrated that such systems could produce yields 2 to 3 times higher than conventional high-altitude farming under comparable conditions, indicating that this was not an accidental adaptation, but a form of engineered microclimate control. The implications are profound because implementing such a system requires an implicit understanding of thermal inertia, heat exchange, hydrology, and long-term climatic observation, yet the Tiwanaku culture left no written language describing these processes. When compared to irrigation systems in Mesopotamia, which relied primarily on river flooding cycles and canal distribution, or even Roman agricultural engineering, which emphasized water transport rather than microclimate manipulation, the Lucarmata system appears conceptually closer to modern agroengineering practices than to its ancient counterparts. This raises a difficult question regarding the nature of knowledge transmission in such societies, because while one hypothesis suggests gradual accumulation of empirical knowledge across generations, and another proposes distributed knowledge systems embedded within communal practice, neither fully accounts for the precision and scalability observed across the landscape, leaving open the possibility that the knowledge was more systematic than currently assumed, but encoded in forms that have not survived or are not yet recognized by modern archaeology. Large-scale agricultural systems typically imply centralized authority structures capable of organizing labor, managing resources, and enforcing coordination, a pattern evident in civilizations ranging from Mesopotamia to ancient Egypt. Yet Lucarmata does not conform to this expectation, as there is no clear evidence of monumental palaces, elite tombs filled with wealth, or dominant religious complexes exerting visible control over the landscape. Instead, The archaeological record suggests a relatively uniform distribution of structures, pointing toward a more decentralized or possibly egalitarian social organization, which directly challenges a foundational assumption in archaeology that complexity must be accompanied by visible hierarchy. This contradiction raises the possibility that Lucamata operated under a different model of social organization, perhaps one in which knowledge systems rather than political authority structured society, or alternatively that the markers of hierarchy were constructed from perishable materials that have not survived, or encoded in symbolic systems that remain undeciphered. In either case, the absence of visible power structures does not indicate simplicity, but rather a form of complexity that does not align with traditional models. By around 1000 CE, both Lucamata and the broader Tiwanaku system entered a period of decline, and paleoclimate data derived from ice cores and lake sediment analysis indicate a prolonged drought between approximately 900 and 1100 CE, which would have reduced water availability and placed stress on agricultural production. Yet this explanation remains incomplete because raised field agriculture is inherently resilient, designed to buffer frost, regulate moisture, and stabilize yields even under fluctuating environmental conditions. If any agricultural system should have endured climatic stress, it would have been this one, and yet it was ultimately abandoned, with no widespread evidence of warfare, no clear destruction layers, and no signs of sudden catastrophe, only a gradual cessation of activity. This pattern suggests a more complex collapse mechanism, possibly involving the breakdown of social coordination, the loss of specialized knowledge required to maintain the system, or a threshold effect in which environmental stress accumulates until even resilient systems fail abruptly. In modern systems theory, such a process is described as nonlinear collapse, where stability persists for long periods before giving way to rapid failure, and Lucamata may represent one of the earliest empirical examples of such dynamics in human history. What do you think? Was Lucamata a deliberate testing ground for one of South America's greatest civilizations? Or are we projecting modern concepts of experimentation onto a past that operated under entirely different principles? Scattered archaeological surveys in the highlands of Eritrea during the mid-20th century began documenting an unusual pattern of stone structures later grouped under what is now referred to as Adi Kawe ruins, a site located at elevations often exceeding 1,500 meters above sea level on a dry, wind-eroded plateau where preservation conditions are paradoxically both harsh and revealing. What drew attention was not monumental scale, but absence. No inscriptions, no carved iconography, no burial markers, and no clear stratified cultural layers typical of long-term settlement. And yet, across the terrain, archaeologists recorded carefully arranged stone constructions, including low walls, segmented enclosures, and geometric layouts that strongly suggest intentional planning rather than random accumulation. Early field notes compared the stonework loosely to proto-urban sites associated with the kingdom of Aksum, dated roughly between 100 and 700 CE. However, Adi Kawe did not conform to expected architectural or cultural patterns from that civilization. Radiocarbon dating from nearby organic traces such as charcoal fragments and soil residues suggests intermittent human activity, possibly ranging from the late 1st millennium BCE to early 1st millennium CE. But these samples remain sparse, fragmented, and spatially inconsistent. Unlike structured sites where occupation phases can be reconstructed layer by layer, Adi Kawe presents what researchers describe as a horizontal mystery, a landscape of structures without narrative depth. The central question emerges immediately. How can a constructed site exist without leaving behind the cultural signature of its builders? At first glance, the ruins appear primitive, consisting of dry stone walls assembled without mortar, using locally sourced rock, but closer inspection reveals patterns that resist that classification. Measurements of surviving wall segments show relatively consistent stone sizing, often ranging between 20 to 40 centimeters in length, with flat contact surfaces that improve load distribution, while the alignment of stones suggests deliberate shaping rather than crude stacking. Some walls maintain structural integrity after centuries of erosion, indicating an understanding of weight balancing and lateral stability. This places Adi Kawe in an unusual comparative position. For instance, in Great Zimbabwe, dry stone construction reaches a high degree of sophistication with walls exceeding 10 meters in height and curvature engineered for stability, whereas Adi Kawe's walls are far smaller, rarely exceeding 1 meter, yet still exhibit proportional planning without scaling into monumental architecture. Similarly, at Nabta Playa, stone arrangements reflect astronomical alignments and ritual function, but Adi Kawe shows no confirmed celestial orientation despite repeated attempts using GIS mapping and azimuth calculations. The contradiction becomes sharper. The builders understood basic engineering principles and applied them consistently across the site, yet they did not develop complexity, ornamentation, or symbolic layering. This is statistically unusual, because in most early societies, once structural competence is achieved, it correlates with population growth, ritual elaboration, or defensive architecture, but Adi Kawe demonstrates none of these trajectories. It is, in essence, a system that functioned without evolving. Aerial surveys and satellite mapping reveal that Adi Kawe is not random, as the layout includes clusters of enclosed spaces arranged in loose grids with pathways or corridors implied between them, while the density varies in a way that suggests zones of activity rather than uniform settlement. However, when archaeologists attempt to classify these zones, the interpretations collapse. No hearths have been definitively identified, no storage pits with preserved contents have been confirmed, and there is no concentration of tools or domestic debris. In established ancient settlements, whether in the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, or East Africa, habitational areas typically leave behind micro-residues such as ash layers, pottery fragments, and faunal remains, meaning that even minimal occupation produces detectable archaeological signatures. Yet at Adi Kawe, such evidence is either absent or below meaningful thresholds. One hypothesis suggests that the site functioned as a transient aggregation point used seasonally by mobile populations, supported by ethnographic parallels in East Africa, where pastoral groups formed temporary stone enclosures for livestock or communal gatherings, but those structures tend to be irregular and rapidly assembled rather than systematically arranged with geometric consistency. Another hypothesis proposes a ritual landscape without material symbolism, a space defined by movement and presence rather than objects, aligning loosely with certain prehistoric sites where ritual activity leaves minimal physical traces. Yet even in those cases, some markers such as post holes, altars, or deposition zones are usually present. Adi Kawe resists both categories, being too organized to be temporary, too empty to be permanent, and too structured to be accidental. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Adi Kawe is its temporal ambiguity. Most archaeological sites can be placed within a developmental sequence including early phase, expansion, peak and decline, reconstructed through stratigraphy, artifact typology, and radiometric dating. But at Adi Kawe, this sequence is missing. Instead, what appears is a discontinuous pattern consisting of isolated radiocarbon dates with wide error margins, a lack of overlapping occupation layers, and no clear evidence of construction phases or modifications over time. In statistical terms, this suggests either extremely short occupation or repeated use without cumulative buildup. When compared to Aksumite urban centers, where coinage, inscriptions, and unimported goods allow precise chronological mapping, or even to smaller sites that typically show at least 2 or 3 occupation layers over centuries. Adikawe shows none. It is as if the site was used and then abandoned without transition, with no destruction layer, no signs of conflict, and no environmental catastrophe recorded in the soil profile. From a systems perspective, this resembles what archaeologists describe as a non-linear occupation event, a phenomenon where human activity occurs without leaving a sustained archaeological footprint, which is rare and often associated with highly mobile or specialized groups, yet the scale of Adikawe complicates this explanation. The broader implication of Adikawe is not limited to one site, but extends to what it represents in the archaeological record of the Horn of Africa. The region is known to have supported complex societies long before the rise of Aksum, with trade networks connecting it to the Red Sea, Arabia, and the Nile Valley. Yet many of these early phases remain poorly documented due to limited excavation and preservation challenges. Adikawe may be part of this hidden layer, suggesting the possibility of a cultural system that operated without leaving durable artifacts. This challenges a fundamental assumption in archaeology that complexity correlates with material output, because if a society organizes space and constructs stable architecture while minimizing or avoiding artifact production, it becomes nearly invisible to conventional methods. Such a model would explain the structured layout without associated objects, the absence of inscriptions or symbolic markers, and the lack of long-term accumulation, but it also raises deeper questions about intentionality and purpose. Why would a society build in stone yet leave no message? Why invest labor in structure without embedding identity into it? And why create a place that does not explain itself? So what do you think Adikawe really was? A settlement, a ritual site, or something we still don't have the tools to understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below. At more than 3,600 meters above sea level, where oxygen thins and agriculture becomes uncertain, an entire stone complex stretches across a narrow ridge for over 3 kilometers, massive walls, circular enclosures, and layered sectors built with a level of coordination that should not belong to a culture barely recorded in history. In northern Peru's La Libertad region, Macahuamachuco was first noted by Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century, but only in the 20th century did systematic surveys begin to reveal its true scale. Not a ruin, but a structured highland system whose size rivals major Andean centers. The immediate anomaly is not its existence, but its mismatch with everything around it. Attributed to the Huamachuco culture between the 4th and 8th centuries CE, the site expands to a scale comparable to Machu Picchu or even parts of Chan Chan, yet it operates outside any known imperial network. With no written system, no clear political lineage, and no surviving narrative to explain how such a structure came into being. What investigators encountered was not a single city, but a fragmented network of sectors. Cerro del Castillo, Las Monjas, El Castillo, each composed of massive stone enclosures, elongated corridors, and striking circular compounds. These were not scattered ruins. They were deliberately organized, repeating architectural units, suggesting a high degree of planning. Yet, unlike later Inca urbanism, which exhibits clear administrative zoning and integration with road systems such as the Quijapac Nian, Macahuamachuco appears spatially isolated. Its location alone raises logistical questions: transporting construction materials, sustaining a population, and maintaining structural integrity at this altitude would have required a level of coordination that implies a complex socio-political system, one that has almost entirely vanished from the historical record. The construction techniques deepen the mystery. The site's walls, in some cases reaching heights of 8 to 10 meters, are built using dry stone masonry stones, stacked without mortar, yet many remain stable after more than 1,500 years of exposure to wind erosion. Thermal variation and seismic activity typical of the Andes. Unlike the precisely interlocking polygonal stones seen at Sacsayhuaman, Macahuamachuco's masonry is less refined in finish but remarkably consistent across large surfaces. This suggests a different engineering priority, not perfection at the micro scale, but repeatability and scalability across vast areas. Experimental archaeology indicates that dry stone walls of this thickness can distribute stress efficiently, but only if the internal packing and weight distribution are carefully controlled. The question is not whether ancient builders could achieve this. It is why they chose this method at such a scale, in a region where finer masonry traditions later emerged. Even more perplexing are the circular structures scattered throughout the site. Some of these enclosures measure up to 20 or 30 meters in diameter, enclosed by thick perimeter walls and often grouped in clusters. In Andean archaeology, circular forms are typically associated with storage facilities known as colcas, used extensively by the Inca for preserving maize and potatoes. However, standard colcas are significantly smaller, optimized for airflow and modular distribution. The structures at Macahuamachuco exceed those dimensions by several orders of magnitude, making a purely utilitarian interpretation inefficient. Alternative hypotheses suggest ceremonial use, but unlike ritual centers such as Chavin de Huanta, there is a notable absence of iconography, carvings, or symbolic orientation tied to cosmological alignments. The architecture communicates intention, but not meaning. Archaeological surveys have also revealed evidence of controlled burning in specific sectors, along with human remains positioned in ways that do not conform to typical burial practices of the region. Some bodies appear to have been deposited rapidly, possibly during episodes of conflict or ritual activity, yet there is no widespread destruction layer consistent with large-scale warfare. This creates a paradox: localized violence or ceremonial burning without evidence of external invasion. In comparative terms, sites like Wari show clearer patterns of expansion, conflict, and eventual decline tied to environmental stress and political fragmentation. Macahuamachuco, by contrast, seems to have undergone a more ambiguous transformation. Parts of it abandoned, parts reused, but never fully integrated into subsequent imperial systems. Population estimates further complicate interpretation. Based on spatial analysis and architectural density, some researchers suggest that the site could have supported several thousand inhabitants at its peak. However, the absence of extensive domestic structures such as hearths, waste deposits, and agricultural terraces directly adjacent to the core complexes suggests that it may not have functioned as a conventional residential city. Instead, it may have served as a periodic gathering site, a regional administrative hub, or even a ceremonial center operating on a seasonal basis. This would align with patterns observed in other pre-Inca societies, where mobility and ritual congregation played a central role in social organization. But again, the scale of Macahuamachuco exceeds what is typically required for such functions. One of the most debated questions is why the site was ultimately abandoned. Radiocarbon dating places its decline around the 8th to 9th centuries CE, a period marked by broader climatic fluctuations in the Andes, including episodes of drought. Environmental stress could have undermined agricultural productivity, forcing populations to relocate. Yet if climate were the primary factor, one would expect similar abandonment patterns across comparable highland sites. Instead, Macahuamachuco appears unusually complete in its desertion structures left standing, not systematically dismantled or repurposed. Later Inca presence is documented, but limited. They occupied portions of the site, modified certain areas, but did not expand or fully integrate it into their administrative network. For a civilization known for absorbing and optimizing existing infrastructure, this selective use is difficult to explain. From a broader perspective, Marca Huamachuco challenges conventional models of Andean development. It suggests the existence of a regional power center operating independently, with architectural capabilities and organizational complexity that rival contemporaneous cultures, yet without leaving behind the cultural markers writing, iconography, extensive material culture that typically allow archaeologists to reconstruct identity and function. In this sense, it resembles a structural ghost, a place defined by what was built rather than by what was recorded. The unresolved questions are not minor gaps in knowledge, they are structural uncertainties. Why construct massive circular enclosures that do not align with known economic or ritual functions? How did a society without a clearly documented hierarchy coordinate labor at this scale? And perhaps most importantly, why does a site of this magnitude leave behind so little narrative evidence compared to its architectural footprint? In archaeology, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but at Marca Huamachuco, the absence itself becomes part of the mystery. Standing on that ridge, surrounded by walls that have outlasted empires, the site does not present itself as a ruin of something understood. It presents itself as a system we have not yet decoded. La Cabana Fortress rises above the entrance of Havana Bay like a stone wall built for an empire that feared the entire Caribbean collapsing around it. Constructed by Spain after the British captured Havana in 1762, the fortress stretches across more than 700 meters of elevated coastline and once housed thousands of soldiers and cannons. But the real mystery is not its size. It is the fact that this massive structure was built on unstable coastal limestone, exposed to salt water, hurricanes, tropical humidity, artillery fire, and centuries of erosion. Yet large sections still remain structurally intact more than 250 years later. Modern engineers studying the fortress discovered something unsettling. Many of its construction techniques appear surprisingly advanced for the 18th century, resembling ideas used in modern military engineering, passive cooling systems, hydraulic management, and even self-repairing construction materials. After Britain briefly seized Havana during the 7 Years' War, Spain realized the city's defenses were catastrophically vulnerable. In response, Spanish military engineers began constructing La Cabana in 1763 on a rocky ridge overlooking the harbour. Historical records estimate that thousands of workers, enslaved labourers, and military engineers spent more than a decade completing the fortress. At first, historians viewed La Cabana as simply another colonial stronghold, but 20th century archaeological surveys and structural analyses began revealing anomalies beneath the walls. Engineers found unusually sophisticated drainage systems, strangely resilient mortar compositions, and geometric defensive designs that seemed far ahead of their time. The deeper researchers looked, the more the fortress resembled a giant engineering experiment hidden inside a military structure. One of the greatest mysteries surrounding La Cabana is how it was able to survive at all on its original foundation. The fortress sits atop karst limestone, a porous geological formation filled with underground cavities, fractures, and weak zones caused by water erosion. Even modern construction projects struggle on karst terrain, because heavy structures can collapse into hidden voids beneath the surface. Yet La Cabana carries millions of kilograms of stone across this unstable ground, with surprisingly little large-scale deformation. Geological surveys suggest Spanish engineers may have created layered compression foundations using crushed coral, compacted lime, clay mixtures and interlocking stone beds that distributed pressure across wider areas. Some researchers compare the system to primitive forms of modern load dispersal foundations used in coastal engineering today. What makes this remarkable is timing. Soil mechanics as a scientific discipline did not formally emerge until the 19th and 20th centuries. Yet La Cabana's builders appear to have understood concepts related to weight distribution, vibration absorption, and terrain stabilization generations earlier. Several structural engineers who modeled the fortress digitally concluded that certain retaining walls may intentionally flex slightly during seismic vibrations and ground movement rather than resisting rigidly. That flexibility may be one reason the structure survived for centuries while many rigid colonial buildings collapsed elsewhere in the Caribbean. The fortress walls themselves contain another mystery. At first glance, they appear like ordinary defensive barriers. But ballistic simulations performed by military historians revealed something unusual about their geometry. Many outer walls are angled in ways that reduce the direct transfer of kinetic energy from cannon impacts. Instead of receiving artillery force head-on, the sloped surfaces redirect part of the impact sideways. In modern engineering, this principle is similar to energy dissipation geometry used in blast-resistant structures. Some simulations suggest certain wall sections could reduce destructive impact forces by nearly 40% compared to flat vertical walls of similar thickness. The walls were also built extraordinarily thick in some areas, exceeding 6 meters. Combined with internal earth-filled reinforcement zones, they acted almost like primitive shock absorbers. This becomes even more impressive when considering 18th century limitations. There were no computers, no modern stress calculations, and no digital modeling software. Yet the fortress demonstrates a surprisingly advanced understanding of force behavior under repeated bombardment. Historians still debate whether these features came from accumulated battlefield experience or from engineering principles now partially forgotten. Beneath La Cabana lies a maze of tunnels, chambers, storage vaults, and gunpowder rooms that continue to puzzle researchers. Havana's climate creates enormous engineering problems for black powder storage. Average humidity levels often exceed 80%, conditions capable of destroying gunpowder effectiveness within relatively short periods. Yet Spanish military documents indicate that La Cabana stored enormous quantities of powder while maintaining operational readiness for long periods. Modern airflow studies suggest the fortress used passive ventilation techniques based on temperature differences between shaded stone chambers and ocean-facing air inlets. Cold air moved through lower tunnels while warmer air escaped through elevated openings, creating a continuous circulation system without mechanical assistance. In some chambers, airflow remains detectable even today. Architectural historians compare the design to passive cooling systems used in Middle Eastern wind towers and modern sustainable architecture. However, La Cabana integrated these concepts into a massive military fortress centuries before climate-controlled infrastructure existed. Some underground sections also appear positioned to minimize moisture condensation naturally. That level of environmental control suggests the builders understood humidity behavior far better than previously believed. Perhaps the most controversial mystery at La Cabana involves its mortar. Most coastal fortresses exposed to salt water and humidity eventually suffer catastrophic cracking. Salt penetrates microscopic fractures, expands over time, and weakens structural bonds. This process destroys countless historical buildings worldwide, but many sections of La Cabana show an unusual phenomenon. Tiny cracks inside the mortar appear partially resealed by newly formed mineral deposits. Laboratory analysis found that the fortress mortar contains high concentrations of lime, coral fragments, volcanic minerals, and microscopic calcium-rich particles. When seawater enters small fractures, chemical reactions trigger calcite crystal growth inside the cracks themselves. In other words, the material may slowly repair portions of its own damage. Modern material scientists call similar behavior autogenous healing or self-healing lime mortar. Researchers today are actively attempting to recreate such systems for sustainable concrete technology because global concrete deterioration costs hundreds of billions of dollars annually. What makes La Cabana extraordinary is that its builders may have accidentally, or intentionally, created a primitive version of this process over 2 centuries ago. Some mortar samples demonstrated compressive durability far exceeding expectations for materials continuously exposed to tropical marine conditions. In several areas, the inner structural core remained surprisingly dense despite visible surface erosion. Comparisons are often made with Roman marine concrete, which also grows stronger over time through seawater-triggered mineral reactions. Roman harbour structures have survived nearly 2,000 years, partly because volcanic ash mixtures formed durable crystalline compounds inside the concrete. La Cabana may represent a similar phenomenon in the Caribbean world, a forgotten material technology hidden inside colonial architecture. To this day, researchers still debate whether the formula resulted from deliberate experimentation or fortunate coincidence. A fortress under siege could survive only as long as its water supply lasted. Archaeologists discovered that La Cabana contains an elaborate rainwater harvesting and underground storage system, connected by carefully angled channels. Water moved entirely through gravity without pumps or mechanical lifting systems. Several reservoirs remained functional even after centuries. Hydraulic specialists studying the system noted that some channel gradients appear remarkably precise, maintaining controlled water flow while minimizing sediment accumulation. Similar engineering principles were used in Roman aqueducts and Persian qanat systems. The existence of such sophisticated water management inside a Caribbean military fortress demonstrates that the builders were not merely constructing walls, they were engineering a self-sustaining defensive machine. What do you think made La Cabana so advanced for its time? Forgotten engineering knowledge, lost materials technology, or something historians still haven't fully understood? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Somewhere beneath the shifting dunes of southern Oman, at the edge of the Rubi al-Khali, the empty quarter, the largest continuous sand desert on Earth, lies the remains of a city once called the Atlantis of the Sands. For centuries, Ubar existed only in legend. Ancient Bedouin tribes spoke of a wealthy caravan city swallowed whole by the desert. Islamic texts described a lost civilization destroyed because of arrogance. Historians dismissed it as myth. Then, in 1992, satellite radar helped archaeologists uncover something buried beneath the sand. Ancient trade routes converging toward a single point in the middle of one of the harshest environments on Earth. The discovery immediately raised a disturbing question. How could a major trade hub survive for centuries in a desert where summer surface temperatures can exceed 70 degrees Celsius, rainfall averages less than 30 millimeters per year, and sandstorms can erase entire landscapes within hours? The search for Ubar began not with shovels, but with space technology. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory used radar imaging from the Space Shuttle and Landsat satellites to scan beneath the sand of southern Arabia. Unlike ordinary photography, radar could penetrate dry desert surfaces and reveal buried geological patterns invisible to the human eye. Researchers noticed faint lines stretching across the empty quarter. These lines turned out to be ancient caravan routes, hardened beneath the sand over centuries of repeated use. What shocked archaeologists was the scale. Multiple routes from Yemen, Oman, and the Persian Gulf all converged at the same isolated location near Shiza in Oman. Excavations soon uncovered the remains of walls, towers, pottery, incense artifacts, and a massive sinkhole beneath a collapsed fortress. Many researchers believed they had finally found Ubar, but the ruins themselves were only the beginning of the mystery. The greatest unanswered puzzle surrounding Ubar is not its destruction, it is navigation. Modern GPS systems struggle in parts of the empty quarter because the landscape constantly changes. Sand dunes can reach heights of over 200 meters and shift dramatically during seasonal winds. Even today, experienced travelers can become lost within hours. Yet thousands of years ago, caravans carrying frankincense traveled across these deserts with astonishing precision. Frankincense was one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world. In Rome, it was burned in temples and funerals. In Egypt, it was used in embalming rituals. Historical records suggest that, pound for pound, high-quality frankincense could rival precious metals in value. Transporting it across Arabia created one of the ancient world's richest trade networks. And somehow, these traders repeatedly crossed vast deserts without maps, satellites, or visible roads. Radar scans revealed something extraordinary beneath the sand. Deeply etched caravan pathways preserved like fossilized highways. Some routes extended for hundreds of kilometers. Their repeated convergence suggests systematic long-distance navigation rather than random wandering. Researchers still cannot fully explain how ancient navigators maintained such accuracy over generations. One theory suggests they relied on stellar navigation far more advanced than previously assumed. Arabian travelers possessed extensive astronomical knowledge, using stars like Sirius and Canopus to determine seasonal movement. But many scholars argue that stars alone would not be enough. Dust storms in the empty quarter can reduce visibility to almost zero, while shifting dunes constantly distort familiar terrain. Other researchers believe caravan leaders memorized underground geological formations invisible to outsiders. Certain buried rock ridges influence dune formation patterns above the surface, creating subtle terrain signatures that remain relatively stable despite shifting sand. If ancient traders understood these patterns, they may have navigated using a kind of environmental mapping system centuries before formal cartography existed. Some scientists compare this to Polynesian navigators crossing the Pacific without instruments. Polynesians memorized ocean swells, star positions, bird migrations, and cloud behavior to travel across thousands of kilometers of open water. The navigators of Ubar may have developed an equally sophisticated desert equivalent, a lost science of reading sand, wind, stars, and geology together. Another mystery involves water. The empty quarter is one of the driest places on Earth, yet Ubar functioned as a caravan center for centuries. Excavations revealed deep wells connected to underground aquifers, formed during wetter, climatic periods thousands of years earlier. But locating these aquifers would have been extraordinarily difficult. Even modern hydrogeologists use satellite imaging and seismic surveys to locate groundwater beneath Arabian deserts. Ancient inhabitants somehow identified reliable water sources with remarkable consistency. Some wells near Shisur descended more than 30 meters into the ground. Maintaining them would have required detailed understanding of soil stability, evaporation, and groundwater pressure. Researchers still debate how this knowledge was acquired. Some believe generations of observation allowed ancient desert populations to detect tiny environmental clues invisible to modern eyes. Mineral deposits, microscopic vegetation changes, humidity differences in rock surfaces, or subtle temperature variations in the sand. If true, the people connected to Ubar may have possessed one of the most advanced environmental survival systems of the ancient world. Then there is the question of the towers. Ancient texts describe Iram of the Pillars, a city of towering columns unlike anything else in Arabia. Some archaeologists believe these references may relate to the fortress towers uncovered at Shisra. Others think the pillars were not buildings at all, but navigation markers placed across trade routes. If that theory is correct, Ubar may have operated large-scale desert guidance networks similar to maritime lighthouse systems. Towers or stone markers positioned at strategic intervals could have helped caravans maintain direction during low visibility conditions. Such infrastructure would imply centralized planning and logistical coordination far beyond what historians traditionally attributed to nomadic Arabian cultures. The collapse of the city only deepened the legend. Beneath the ruins, archaeologists discovered a massive limestone cavity. Evidence suggests the fortress eventually collapsed into a sinkhole created by erosion beneath the settlement. One theory argues that centuries of drawing groundwater weakened the underground structure until the surface suddenly gave way. This possibility is scientifically plausible. Similar sinkholes occur today when underground cavities lose structural support, but the scale of collapse at Ubar remains unusual given the surrounding geology. Some researchers suspect there may still be extensive underground chambers or cave systems hidden beneath the desert floor. To ancient witnesses, such a disaster would have appeared supernatural, an entire fortress consumed by the earth itself. This may explain why regional legends describe the city as being swallowed by God. Yet perhaps the biggest mystery is whether Ubar was ever a single city at all. Increasing numbers of historians believe Ubar may have referred not to one location, but to an interconnected network of caravan stations, wells, forts, and trading centers spread across southern Arabia. The ruins at Shirse may have been only one node within a much larger logistical system supporting incense trade across the desert. If true, it would force historians to rethink ancient Arabian civilization entirely. Instead of isolated desert tribes surviving at the edge of history, Arabia may once have hosted a highly organized transportation economy, capable of coordinating trade across thousands of kilometers of hostile terrain. Do you think Ubar was truly a single lost city, or an enormous hidden desert network far more advanced than historians once believed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Rising from the edge of Israel's Negev desert about 30 kilometers west of the Dead Sea, Tel Arad stands in one of the driest regions of the ancient Near East, where annual rainfall averages less than 100 millimeters. Permanent settlement in this environment should have been nearly impossible without advanced water management. Yet beneath layers of dust and collapsed stone, archaeologists uncovered evidence of a fortified city that survived for centuries against conditions that still challenge modern infrastructure. The site was first identified during surveys in the 20th century, but major excavations began in the 1960s under Israeli archaeologist Yohanan Aharoni. What emerged shocked researchers. Tel Arad was not a single settlement. It was a massive archaeological mound containing two entirely different cities from different eras. A large Canaanite urban center from around the 3rd millennium BCE, and later an Iron Age Judahite fortress built nearly 2,000 years afterward. The deeper archaeologists dug, the stranger the site became. Sophisticated water systems appeared in terrain with almost no natural water source. Massive defensive walls revealed advanced engineering logic. Religious structures challenged long-held assumptions about ancient Judahite worship. Hundreds of inscriptions hinted at literacy levels far beyond what historians expected for a small desert kingdom. Tel Arad slowly transformed from a forgotten desert ruin into one of the most mysterious archaeological sites in the ancient Levant. The greatest mystery surrounding Tel Arad may be its survival itself. Ancient cities usually formed around rivers. Egypt depended on the Nile. Mesopotamian cities relied on the Tigris and Euphrates. Even smaller Levantine settlements typically emerged near springs or seasonal streams. Tel Arad had none of these advantages, yet archaeologists discovered a highly sophisticated hydraulic system, capable of collecting and storing enormous quantities of rainwater. The city used carefully engineered channels carved into the terrain to direct flash flood runoff into giant underground cisterns. Some reservoirs could hold hundreds of thousands of liters of water, The engineering precision is difficult to explain for such an early period. Water channels required extremely controlled gradients. If the angle was too steep, erosion would destroy the system. Too shallow, and water would stagnate or fail to reach storage areas. Modern hydrological studies show that even minor errors in slope calculation can collapse an entire desert collection network. At Tel Arad, many channels maintained remarkably stable flow patterns despite being constructed more than 4,000 years ago using primitive tools. Researchers also discovered evidence of sediment filtration systems. Smaller chambers trapped mud and debris before water entered the main reservoirs. This reduced contamination and preserved drinking supplies for longer periods. Similar filtration concepts would later appear in far more famous Roman hydraulic systems, yet Tel Arad predates many of them by over a millennium. Some engineers comparing ancient water technologies have noted similarities between Tel Arad and Nabatean desert systems at Petra. However, Petra flourished much later and benefited from more advanced masonry techniques. Tel Arad achieved comparable desert adaptation using simpler materials and far earlier technology. The question remains deeply unsettling. How did a Bronze Age settlement in an almost waterless desert develop hydraulic knowledge sophisticated enough to sustain urban life for centuries? Tel Arad was not only designed to survive drought, it was designed to survive war. Excavations revealed multiple defensive phases stacked almost perfectly on top of one another across centuries. At least 12 major occupation layers have been identified, yet many later walls aligned closely with earlier foundations despite the absence of modern surveying equipment. Some fortification walls exceeded 4 meters in thickness. Their internal structure suggests intentional shock absorption design. Outer layers of stone and mud brick absorbed impact energy, while inner cores stabilized the structure. Modern military engineers have compared this principle to layered defensive architecture used in later fortifications. The mud bricks themselves created another mystery. In desert environments, mud brick structures normally erode rapidly under cycles of heat, wind, and rare but destructive rainstorms. Yet many sections at Tel Arad survived in unusually good condition for more than 2,000 years. Laboratory analysis suggests ancient builders carefully optimized mixtures of clay, straw, ash, and mineral additives. Some samples show unusually dense microstructures that reduced cracking and moisture penetration. Similar durability has been observed at a few other Near Eastern sites, but the exact production formula remains unknown. This has led some materials scientists to speculate that ancient builders possessed empirical construction knowledge far more advanced than historians previously believed. They may not have understood chemistry in modern terms, but generations of experimentation could have produced highly refined engineering traditions lost over time. One of the most controversial discoveries at Tel Arad was hidden inside the Judahite fortress itself. Archaeologists uncovered a small temple remarkably similar in layout to descriptions of the first temple in Jerusalem. It contained an outer courtyard, sacrificial altar, inner sanctuary, and a Holy of Holies-like chamber. This created a major historical problem. According to traditional interpretations of biblical history, centralized worship should have been focused primarily in Jerusalem. Yet Tel Arad appeared to maintain its own organized temple complex deep in the desert frontier. The mysteries intensified in 2020 when residue analysis on 2 limestone altars produced extraordinary results. Researchers identified traces of frankincense on one altar and cannabinoid compounds on the other. Evidence suggested that a psychoactive substance may have been burned during ritual ceremonies. This discovery triggered major debate among historians and neuroscientists. Altered states of consciousness have appeared in many ancient religions worldwide, from Greek mystery cults to shamanic traditions in Central Asia. But direct physical evidence connecting psychoactive compounds to ancient Judahite worship was almost non-existent before Tel Arad. The implications are enormous. Did ancient priests intentionally manipulate human consciousness during rituals? Did they understand the neurological effects of specific plants? Or were these substances symbolic offerings rather than inhaled compounds? No definitive answer exists. Tel Arad occupied a strategically important position between Judah, the Negev desert, and trade routes toward the Dead Sea. From its elevated position, observers could monitor movement across vast distances. Some researchers believe Tel Arad formed part of a larger military signaling network, connecting multiple desert fortresses. The spacing between several Judahite strongholds appear unusually optimized for line-of-sight communication. Fire beacons, smoke signals, or reflective surfaces may have transmitted warnings rapidly across the frontier. This concept resembles a primitive optical communication network, essentially an ancient long-distance messaging system. But recreating such a system experimentally has revealed serious problems. Desert winds distort smoke patterns. Dust storms reduce visibility dramatically. Heat shimmer can disrupt distant visual signals. Maintaining reliable communication over tens of kilometers would have required careful coordination and environmental knowledge. Some military historians argue that the success of these systems may indicate a much higher level of organizational sophistication within the Kingdom of Judah than previously assumed. Tel Arad may not have been an isolated desert outpost. It may have been part of a coordinated frontier defense system operating with surprising efficiency. Perhaps the most revolutionary discoveries at Tel Arad were not walls or temples, but fragments of broken pottery. More than 100 ostraka, pottery shards containing ink inscriptions in ancient Hebrew, were recovered from the fortress. The texts included military orders, supply records, food distributions, wine shipments, and troop instructions. At first, scholars assumed only elite scribes could write such documents. Then computational handwriting analysis changed everything. Using artificial intelligence and forensic comparison methods, researchers concluded that multiple individuals likely wrote the inscriptions. This suggested literacy was not limited to a tiny administrative elite. Ordinary military officers and supply personnel may also have possessed writing skills. If true, this completely alters previous assumptions about education and governance in 7th century BCE Judah. Some historians now argue that the administrative complexity visible at Tel Arad indicates a far more organized state system than once believed. Maintaining logistics in a harsh desert fortress required accurate accounting, communication chains, and coordinated supply networks. This raises a disturbing possibility for archaeologists. If literacy and administration were already this advanced in remote frontier settlements, how much ancient technological and organizational knowledge has been underestimated elsewhere? Ainam Dabadib sits deep inside Egypt's western desert, nearly isolated from the modern world by hundreds of kilometers of barren rock and sand. Today, the area looks almost uninhabitable. Annual rainfall is effectively zero, while summer temperatures regularly exceed 113 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet archaeologists discovered evidence that, nearly 2,000 years ago, this place supported a functioning agricultural settlement, a fortified town, and one of the most sophisticated underground hydraulic systems ever built along the Roman desert frontier. The ruins first attracted serious archaeological attention during 19th century expeditions across the Karga Oasis. Early explorers documented a massive mud brick fortress standing above the desert floor and noticed strange circular holes stretching across the landscape in perfectly aligned rows. At first, many believed they were abandoned wells or natural collapses. Later surveys revealed something far more disturbing. Those holes were entrances to underground tunnels extending for kilometers beneath the desert. The system formed part of a Qanat network, an ancient gravity-fed hydraulic technology capable of transporting groundwater across extreme arid terrain without pumps or mechanical machines. Modern satellite imagery later revealed that Ain Dabadib was not an isolated structure at all, but part of a larger Roman agricultural network spread throughout the Karga Depression. Archaeologists gradually uncovered irrigation fields, storage structures, roads, housing complexes, and military-style defensive architecture. Every excavation produced the same question: how did an ancient civilization maintain this level of hydraulic precision in one of the harshest environments on Earth? Nothing at Ain Dabadib is more mysterious than the vertical shafts. Seen from above, the desert is covered with long dotted lines stretching across the landscape. Each dot is a shaft descending vertically into the ground, some reaching depths estimated between 20 and 40 feet, while others may extend even deeper. Hundreds of them exist across the site. These shafts connected to underground tunnels carrying water from distant aquifers toward the settlement. At first glance, the system resembles modern mining infrastructure or industrial ventilation networks, rather than Roman engineering. The terrifying part is the precision. The shafts were aligned with extraordinary consistency across difficult terrain without aerial surveying, GPS, laser leveling, or modern geological mapping. Even a small angular error underground would cause two tunnel sections to completely miss each other, yet many shafts connect almost perfectly to narrow subterranean channels carved through compact desert rock. Modern engineers studying Qanat systems have pointed out that maintaining a stable tunnel gradient is one of the hardest aspects of underground hydraulic construction. If the slope is too steep, water velocity erodes the tunnel walls. If it is too shallow, water stagnates and sediment accumulates. Some Qanat systems in the Middle East maintain gradients of less than 1 meter per kilometer, level of precision comparable to engineering tolerances that remain difficult even today without advanced instruments. The unanswered mystery is how Roman workers at Ain Dabadib measured underground elevation changes so accurately. Some theories suggest they relied on astronomical observations, plumbline geometry, water leveling techniques, shadow tracking from the sun, or repeated shaft triangulation, but no surviving document explains the exact surveying method. Even more mysterious is the labor itself. Excavating a single deep shaft through compact desert material without powered drilling would have required enormous manpower. Ventilation underground would have been extremely limited, while temperatures inside narrow shafts could become lethal. Yet workers maintained tunnel stability over long distances with minimal collapse evidence. Some archaeologists compare the logistical complexity of these qanats to Roman mining operations in Spain or the underground aqueduct systems of Persia. Others argue the network may preserve engineering traditions inherited from pre-Roman desert cultures whose knowledge later disappeared completely. To this day, parts of the shaft system remain unmapped because modern exploration inside the tunnels is still dangerous. As excavations continued, archaeologists uncovered a massive multi-story mud brick fortress overlooking the settlement. This alone created another engineering mystery. Mud brick is normally vulnerable to erosion, moisture damage, thermal expansion, and structural fatigue. Yet the Ain Dabadib fortress survived nearly 2 millennia in extreme desert conditions. Researchers analyzing ancient mud brick architecture discovered that some Roman desert bricks contained carefully balanced mixtures of clay, straw fibers, mineral salts, and compacted sediment. The walls at Ain Dabadib are unusually thick, allowing thermal insulation against violent desert temperature swings. Some sections may even have functioned as passive cooling systems, reducing internal heat during the day while retaining warmth at night. The fortress also appears strategically positioned for surveillance over agricultural land and water routes. Its elevated design suggests a combined civilian and military function. Archaeologists later uncovered evidence of storage rooms, staircases, and organized residential sectors inside the structure. Every excavation layer revealed a settlement far more sophisticated than previously believed. Satellite surveys completely transformed understanding of the site. What initially appeared to be empty desert turned out to contain traces of ancient agricultural grids extending outward from the Qanat system. Researchers identified irrigation channels, field divisions, and buried settlement infrastructure beneath drifting sand. This discovery raised another major mystery. Today, the surrounding terrain can barely support vegetation, yet Roman farmers cultivated crops here for generations. Hydrologists studying the site believe the inhabitants tapped fossil groundwater stored deep beneath the Sahara. Some of this water may have accumulated during wetter climatic periods thousands of years earlier, when parts of the Sahara contained rivers, lakes, and grasslands. In other words, Ain Dabadib may have depended on ancient prehistoric water. This creates a disturbing possibility. The settlement's survival may have relied on a non-renewable resource slowly being exhausted beneath the desert. Some researchers estimate that Saharan fossil aquifers contain water tens of thousands of years old, meaning recovery after depletion would be nearly impossible on human timescales. That means the civilization at Ain Dabadib may have unknowingly consumed a hidden water reserve created during an entirely different climate era. Modern technology continues revealing new details beneath the sand. Researchers now use ground-penetrating radar, drone mapping, satellite imagery, three-dimensional terrain reconstruction, and digital hydrological modeling to investigate the site. These tools have identified buried tunnel extensions and possible unexplored Qanat branches still hidden underground. Some sections remain inaccessible because oxygen levels are unstable, collapses remain possible, and temperatures become extreme inside confined tunnels. In several cases, archaeologists discovered that visible shafts on the surface connected to far more complicated underground junctions than expected. Certain alignments suggest coordinated planning over large distances rather than isolated construction phases. The scale increasingly resembles a regional infrastructure system rather than a small oasis settlement. Some experts now believe Ain Dabadib formed part of a broader Roman strategy designed to control trade, agriculture, and military movement across Egypt's western desert. Do you think the engineers of Ain Dabadib possess surveying knowledge far beyond what historians currently understand? Or could an even older lost technology have influenced the construction of these underground tunnels? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Buried at the edge of the Rub al-Khali Desert in southern Arabia, Qaryat al-Faw once stood where summer temperatures can exceed 113 degrees Fahrenheit, and sandstorms erase entire landscapes in days. Yet beneath the dunes, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a sophisticated urban centre that survived for centuries in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Even more disturbing to researchers was not the city itself, but the technology hidden inside it. Advanced water systems, climate-adapted architecture, mineral pigments that refused to fade for 2,000 years, and inscriptions carved with a precision that should have been nearly impossible using the tools available at the time. Qaryat al-Faw was discovered in the mid-20th century when explorers and Saudi researchers began investigating ancient caravan routes crossing the Arabian Peninsula. Excavations later revealed that the city had once served as the capital of the ancient Kindar kingdom and a major stop on the incense trade network connecting Yemen to Mesopotamia, Persia, and the Mediterranean world. Archaeologists uncovered temples, markets, multi-room houses, workshops, tombs, and hundreds of inscriptions spread across a massive desert settlement. Some estimates suggest the inhabited zone covered more than 7 square kilometers, enormous for an inland Arabian city surrounded by barren terrain. But the deeper excavations went, the stranger the site became. One of the first mysteries was survival itself. Qaryat al-Faw existed in an environment with extremely limited rainfall, often less than 4 inches annually. Modern hydrologists studying the region argue that sustaining a permanent urban population under such conditions should have been extraordinarily difficult without highly organized water management. Yet excavations uncovered deep wells, underground channels, reservoirs, and carefully distributed water points positioned with surprising regularity across the settlement. Some wells penetrated deeply into underground aquifers, and mineral analysis showed they were used continuously for long periods without immediate collapse of the water table. Researchers compared the system to Persian Qanat engineering, one of the most sophisticated hydraulic technologies of the ancient world. However, Qaryat al-Faw lies in a different geological environment, meaning the inhabitants may have developed independent methods adapted specifically for Arabian desert conditions. Even today, archaeologists still debate how accurately the builders understood groundwater behavior beneath shifting desert terrain. The architecture itself created another puzzle. Many buildings were constructed using mud brick and local stone, materials normally vulnerable to rapid erosion under extreme desert conditions. Yet numerous walls survived nearly intact after almost 2 millennia of exposure. Some structures featured unusually thick-layered walls that acted as thermal buffers, reducing interior temperature fluctuations between the scorching daytime heat and the cold desert nights. Modern thermal simulations suggest certain houses may have remained several degrees cooler inside without mechanical ventilation. Narrow corridors, small external openings, and strategic orientation appear to have generated natural airflow patterns similar to the wind-catching systems later famous in Persian architecture. In some compounds, angled entrances may even have reduced the force of incoming sandstorms by redirecting airflow around the structure rather than directly into it. To engineers studying ancient climate adaptation, the city looks less like a primitive desert outpost and more like a carefully optimized environmental machine. But the most mysterious discoveries emerged from the walls themselves. Inside several buildings and tomb chambers, archaeologists found murals and painted surfaces whose colors remained visible after nearly 2,000 years buried beneath sand and exposed to severe heat cycles. In a region where ultraviolet radiation rapidly destroys organic pigments, the survival of these paintings shocked conservation experts. Chemical analysis revealed pigments containing complex mineral compositions, including iron oxides, copper compounds, and processed earth minerals likely heated before application. Some researchers believe the pigments may have undergone controlled thermal treatment to stabilize color molecules before being mixed into binders. Under magnification, portions of the paint appeared deeply fused into plaster surfaces rather than merely sitting on top of them. This created comparisons to mineral fresco techniques seen in parts of the Roman world, but several specialists noted that the preservation at Qaryat al-Faw was unusually strong considering the desert environment. Certain red and black pigments retained contrast levels far beyond what researchers expected after centuries of exposure. One particularly strange detail involved microscopic crystalline formations embedded within some painted layers. These formations may have formed naturally through mineral interaction over time, but some experts suspect the ancient artisans intentionally manipulated the chemistry of the plaster itself. If true, this would suggest a surprisingly advanced empirical understanding of how pigments chemically bond with architectural surfaces. The inscriptions found throughout the city raised even more questions. Hundreds of carved texts written in ancient South Arabian script appeared across tombs, monuments, and stone surfaces. Many lines were engraved with remarkable consistency and depth and spacing. On harder stone surfaces, The precision became difficult to explain. Some grooves displayed extremely sharp edges with minimal deviation across long inscriptions. Experimental archaeologists attempting to recreate similar engravings using reconstructed Iron Age tools discovered how difficult it was to maintain such uniformity over extended carving sessions. Bronze and early iron chisels typically wear down rapidly against hard stone, yet the inscriptions at Caryat al-4 maintain highly controlled line geometry. Some scholars propose that artisans may have used abrasive mineral slurries combined with cutting tools to improve accuracy, similar to techniques suspected in parts of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Others believe generations of highly specialized craftsmen refined methods now completely lost. The exact process remains uncertain. The tombs uncovered beneath the city added another layer of mystery. Many burial chambers contained luxury goods imported from distant regions, including glassware, incense containers, metal objects, and decorative items showing influences from Greece, Persia, and southern Arabia simultaneously. This indicated that Caryat al-4 was not isolated at all. It was deeply connected to international trade networks stretching across thousands of miles. Several elite tombs contained elaborate wall decorations and carefully planned burial layouts suggesting a highly stratified society. Some chambers featured multiple compartments and symbolic carvings whose meanings remain debated. Archaeologists also uncovered traces of perfumes and aromatic substances preserved inside sealed containers, evidence of a sophisticated trade economy built around luxury goods. Yet despite its apparent wealth and technological adaptation, the city eventually collapsed. Archaeological evidence suggests the decline may have happened relatively quickly. Trade routes shifted, water systems may have failed, climate conditions across Arabia changed gradually during late antiquity, possibly reducing already fragile groundwater reserves. Some sediment studies indicate increasing desertification around the settlement over time. But researchers still cannot fully explain why a city that survived centuries of extreme desert conditions suddenly disappeared. If its hydraulic systems were truly this advanced, why could they not adapt further? If the inhabitants understood environmental engineering so well, what caused the balance to break? What do you think really caused the fall of Caryat al-4? Climate collapse, failed water systems, or something we still haven't discovered yet? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Mizdokan does not enter history through a single dramatic excavation, but through gradual exposure. Situated near Nukus, in the autonomous region of Karakalpakstan, the site began to reveal itself as shifting desert winds stripped away layers of sand, exposing tombs, mausoleums, and structural remains across a vast plateau. By the 20th century, archaeologists recognized that this was not an isolated burial ground, but a necropolis spanning over 200 hectares, with occupation phases dating from approximately the 4th century BCE through the 14th century CE. Unlike sites such as Pompeii, which were preserved by sudden catastrophe, Mizdokan emerged slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the landscape itself decided when fragments of its past could be seen. The first anomaly at Mizdokan is scale. Surveys indicate thousands of graves, mausoleums, and burial structures densely distributed across the site. If one assumes even a conservative estimate, an average of 2 to 4 individuals per burial unit, the total number of interments could reach into the tens of thousands. Yet there is no corresponding evidence of a continuously inhabited urban centre of comparable size nearby during the same periods. For comparison, the necropolis of Saqqara in Egypt was directly tied to the nearby capital of Memphis, serving a defined population. Similarly, Roman burial complexes surrounding cities like Pompeii or Ostia reflect urban demographics. Mizdokan breaks this pattern. Its burial capacity appears disproportionate to any known local settlement. raising the possibility that it functioned as a regional or even supra-regional funerary hub. This leads to an unresolved logistical question. How were bodies transported, processed, and buried here over more than a millennium in an environment lacking obvious infrastructure? No large-scale road systems, storage facilities, or administrative centers have been conclusively identified at the scale required to support such sustained activity. Another anomaly lies in continuity. Mizdakan was not used by a single civilization, but by multiple cultural and religious traditions over more than 1,000 years, including pre-Islamic communities, adherents of Zoroastrianism, and later Islamic populations. Excavations reveal overlapping burial layers rather than clearly separated chronological zones. In many cases, newer graves were constructed directly above or adjacent to older ones without fully disturbing them. This pattern suggests not replacement but integration, a rare phenomenon in ancient burial practices. In contrast, many sites show clear discontinuities when belief systems shift. For instance, in parts of the Roman Empire, pagan burial customs were replaced or reorganized under Christianity. At Mizdakan, however, the site retained its significance across ideological transitions. The question remains, how was knowledge of this location preserved across centuries of political change, migration, and environmental stress? Oral transmission alone would struggle to maintain such precision over extended periods, yet there is no definitive evidence of continuous written records guiding this persistence. Perhaps the most technically puzzling aspect of Mizdakan lies in its architecture. The majority of its structures, mausoleums, tomb enclosures, boundary walls are constructed from sun-dried mud brick and locally sourced clay. In most environmental models, such materials are considered highly vulnerable. Exposure to temperature fluctuations, wind erosion, and occasional precipitation should degrade them rapidly. In arid regions, unprotected adobe structures often deteriorate within decades, not centuries. Yet, at Mizdakan, many of these constructions have endured for hundreds, in some cases over 1,000 years. Walls remain standing, vaults retain partial integrity, and foundational layouts are still legible. This durability invites comparison with other earthen architecture sites such as Chan Chan or Bam Citadel. However, even in those cases, preservation often depends on either minimal rainfall or modern conservation efforts. Mizdakan, by contrast, appears to have survived prolonged exposure with limited intervention. One possible explanation lies in material composition. Ancient builders may have optimized clay mixtures with specific ratios of silt, sand, and organic fibers, increasing resistance to cracking and erosion. Another factor could be structural design, thick walls, minimal openings, and geometric forms that distribute stress efficiently. Still, these hypotheses remain incomplete. No definitive reconstruction of the original construction techniques has been universally accepted. More intriguingly, the site suggests a form of environmental adaptation that borders on engineering intuition. Structures are often positioned to reduce direct exposure to prevailing winds, and some align with natural contours that limit erosion. This implies not just construction skill, but an understanding of long-term environmental dynamics, an understanding that is difficult to quantify and even harder to prove. The paradox is clear. Materials considered weak by modern standards have demonstrated resilience exceeding expectations. The question is not simply how they were built, but what knowledge system allowed ancient builders to anticipate conditions centuries into the future. Among the most persistent narratives associated with Mizdakan is the legend of a tomb believed to belong to Adam. According to local tradition, a stack of bricks atop the structure diminishes over time, one brick falling at intervals. When the final brick disappears, the world will end. At first glance, this appears to be purely symbolic. However, the story persists in part because observers claim to notice changes in the structure across generations. While no controlled longitudinal study has verified a consistent rate of brick loss, the perception of gradual change reinforces the narrative. From a physical standpoint, erosion, gravity, and structural instability could explain incremental collapse. But the alignment between observed degradation and a culturally embedded countdown is what makes the phenomenon difficult to dismiss entirely. It represents a convergence of environmental process and human interpretation where natural decay is framed as temporal measurement. Mizdokan defies clear classification. It is not merely a cemetery, nor truly a city or a defined religious center, but rather a system that persisted across centuries while adapting to a harsh environment. Why was this location chosen and continuously reused? How did generations separated by hundreds of years maintain a shared understanding of its significance? And what allowed structures made of earth to survive far beyond expected limits? Unlike stone monuments or sites supported by written records, Mizdokan leaves its answers embedded in soil and structure, ambiguous, silent, and still not fully understood. So what do you think Mizdokan really was, and why was it preserved for so long? Share your thoughts in the comments below.